World building is one of the fundamental principles of effective narrative design. It helps to shape everything: character motivations, the weight of their choices, and the history of the places they visit after embarking on their quest. Get this wrong, and the story can struggle. But create a world that people care about, one they can lose themselves in, whether through their own imaginations or the eyes of the characters they've become invested in, and suddenly, doors open. Such a feat was accomplished by the creative team tasked with fusing Final Fantasy with the tactical subgenre of role-playing games. And even now, over 2 decades since it first graced gaming consoles around the world, Ivalice stirs the imagination of those who chose to invest and venture into a different kind of world. But there's so much more to Ivalice than meets the eye. We therefore implore you to join us on a new adventure, one where we explore Ivalice through the lens of Final Fantasy Tactics. Chapter 1: The Age of Myths. Long before the first castle was built, before humans walked the face of the realm, before even the creation of the realm itself, there was war. Prior to history's record, there existed an enduring conflict between 2 tribes of beings that were difficult for the minds of men to comprehend. Those 2 tribes were the Fabar and the Danann. The 2 contingents battled day in and day out for supremacy over all things, never breaking their stalemate, and a great many were lost in the fighting. Already having lasted for millennia, there seemed to be no end in sight for this celestial battle. The Fabar and the Danann seemed destined to be locked in an everlasting struggle. The Danann, for their part, considered themselves to be a noble tribe. Their ruler was the god king Zabam, was an ability to place trust in those who served him, and this gave the Danann strength. Amongst his closest allies, there was none more trusted by Zabam than Arnas. By proving his worth on the battlefield, Arnas had helped the Danann, and by extension Zabam, achieve countless victories. His prowess was noted, and after rising to the rank of general, Arnas was expected to deliver results for his king in high-stakes battles. The relationship between the pair was therefore ironclad, and their bond seemed unbreakable. Others within the Danann looked up to them as a pillar of strength, and it seemed that nothing could be done to break the union of mind, body, and spirit. Doubt, however, is a powerful emotion, and one day the divine god Matoya came to Zabam with an upsetting prophecy. He was to be betrayed by Arnas. Zabam was distraught at this news. After everything they had been through together, it was blasphemous to even suggest that Arnas might end their friendship through an act of betrayal. But, though he wished to believe that Matoya's prediction was nothing more than mere superstition, he knew all too well of the veracity of the prophet god's visions. Far too often had Matoya's words of foresight proven unnervingly accurate. And so, against his better judgment, Zabam decided to treat Matoya's prophecy with the utmost seriousness. For if it turned out to be true, their entire war effort and all the sacrifices they had made would have been for nothing. Zabam acted swiftly. Without warning, Arnas was stripped of his rank and preemptively imprisoned for a crime he had not even committed. Such a move caused discontent amongst the Danann forces, but Zabam was happy to shoulder that burden now that the supposed threat to his tribe had been dealt with. After all, who was he, or anyone else, to question the wise words of Matoya? But unbeknownst to Zabam, Arnas started secretly plotting his revenge from prison, vowing to bring about Zabam's ruin as retribution for the slight to his name and the subsequent embarrassment. Though exacting his revenge was difficult given his extreme disadvantage, Arnas was patient. Zabam struggled to justify his decision to the people. After all, he'd always been so willing to trust. Why not trust Arnas this time instead of some prophecy? The lack of proof or evidence meant that Arnas started to gain sympathizers, and when their numbers were large enough, they coordinated to see Arnas released from imprisonment that they still deemed to be unjust. They were successful, and now free, Arnas and his disciples went straight to Zabam's bitter rival, the Fabar. Under the guise of seeking revenge, they collectively pledged their allegiance. The Fabar, and their leader, Wayaka, had been seeking the downfall of Z'Barm for what seemed like an eternity. The chance to join forces with Z'Barm's former general therefore pleased Wayaka to no end, and due to the nature of the fallout, he did not believe Arnis's defection to be some simple ruse. If anything, the situation was beyond poetic. How delightful it would be to see his ancient enemy struck down by the one he had once considered his closest and most trusted friend. And so, Arnis and his followers, those who had grown disillusioned with the rule of Z'Barm, joined the Fabar and Wayaka and staged a grand assault. This chain of events meant that Z'Barm had unknowingly fallen foul of a self-fulfilling prophecy. What Matoya had said did come to pass, but Arnis had never had any thoughts of betraying his beloved friend and ally until he was wrongly and preemptively imprisoned. This action then led to his betrayal, and with Arnis siding with the Fabar, it tipped the scales of the war. Arnis, however, was not satisfied with the outcome. He wanted Z'Barm to suffer for his misdeeds beyond just having to stare down the barrel of defeat. As such, with Wayaka's permission, once the war had concluded, Arnis turned Z'Barm into a place called Ivalice. His body was to become a living, breathing entity, doomed and imprisoned for all eternity, and Arnis was given permission to rule as the Lord of Ivalice. To ensure the upholding of Z'Barm's sentence and his everlasting torment, Arnis then created humans to inhabit his new realm. They were tasked with working the land and seeing it prosper. And due to the nature of the task, Arnis made the humans smart enough to seek entertainment so as to offset the potential monotony of their endless toiling. But he also made them weak enough so that they would not venture above their station. Content with the outcome of his designs, Arnis then departed from the world, returning to the heavens to rule from on high. However, Arnis's hubris soon got the better of him. For in his desire to create the perfect caretakers, he made a fatal error. Arnis had given humans ambition. Though their primary objective was to tend the land that Arnis had made, humans proved adaptive and quickly began creating societies, building shelters, crafting tools, and amassing knowledge. Left to their devices, the humans began to overconsume, and this started to threaten the elaborate punishment Arnis had crafted for Z'Barm by ending his suffering prematurely. Furious with this development, Arnis returned. Something had to be done to keep the humans in check. But Arnis did not have the time nor interest in babysitting his new creations for eternity. The entire idea was that Z'Barm was meant to suffer in perpetuity with minimal effort. But it became clear that additional checks and balances needed to be put in place for the inhabitants of Ivalice. Arnis felt the only solution was therefore to create something that could fulfill this task. So he split himself in two, creating new gods in his stead. Perseus, designed to watch over the day, and Metzelus, who watched over the night. Arnis then retreated, leaving his new creations to their task. As manifestations of Arnis, Perseus and Metzelus wasted no time. But they did so in the exact same way, as of course, their time was also too important for things as trivial as administration. To that end, they created the Acuria, a race of beings who existed beneath them. Their job was to oversee the tempering of humanity's ambitions without Perseus and Metzelus needing to be hands-on. After being created, the Acuria set about their task. They helped to reshape the world in order to inhibit the desires of man and keep them busy. And beyond that, by acting as proxies for the will of the gods, the Acuria set about influencing humanity, pulling the strings from the shadows and manufacturing both false successes and real failures for their new playthings. But this dynamic did not last for long. The Acuria were able to keep humanity occupied, but it was hard work due to their unpredictability. With humanity therefore being more difficult to control than the Acuria first realized, they felt as though the task could be better handled through a degree of automation. So, instead of doing the tasks set to them by Perseus and Metzelus themselves, they decided to take advantage of the power they had been granted. The Acuria went off script. To that end, they set about creating races of their own, that were designed to occupy Ivalice alongside humanity. Their objective was to add biodiversity to the environment, something they hoped would add a degree of self-regulation. Everything was carefully planned out so that humanity would be inhibited just enough, but not too much that they may struggle to survive. It was all about balance. Some examples of races created by the Ajora were the dragons and the fairies, and each was given, like the Ajora themselves, a specific role to play. Dragons were crafted as the apex predators of the world. They possessed both physical prowess and robust innate elemental magic. Coming in a variety of classes, from the lowly plate worms to the great dragons and fell dragons, they acted as the guardians of balance and the keeper of the land's biomes, there to keep populations in check and create the ultimate bulwark should some kind of insurrection against the Ajora ever occur. Each was given a specific ecosystem to safeguard. This meant individual dragons, such as the Elder Worm, sat atop the hierarchies of the forests, jungles, and other areas, and they helped to maintain the diverse population of plants, animals, and insects. From a more support-orientated role, the fairies existed alongside the dragons. They shared in their responsibilities by using magical abilities to help Ivalice's flora and fauna prosper and propagate, there to counteract the overconsumption of humanity where required. Likewise, Reavers and Hydra functioned as lesser predators underneath the dragons and rounded out the hierarchy of the broader ecosystem, helping to control populations and provide humanity with another problem to solve. But the greatest race of beings created by the Ajora were not the dragons or the fairies, or the Reavers or the Hydra. They were the Scions. Just as Perseus and Metzelus represented the day and night, so too did the Ajora create two groups of Scions, the light and the dark. Though the other races created by the Ajora were designed to act on their own accord, bringing balance to Ivalice through organic interaction, the Scions were a different beast altogether. They were created to act as an extension of the will of the Ajora, serving as their direct authority in Ivalice. But this unique role had another aspect. Due to how complex Ivalice was becoming, the Ajora had been required to create multiple planes of existence. With so many entities now brought into being, such a system felt necessary, as the mortal realm, where life happened for most of its inhabitants and which encompassed the majority of humanity, was no longer sufficient. The other realms were collectively known as other worlds. These planes existed within the wider concept of Ivalice, but many were obscured either completely or partially to the other races created by the Ajora, such as the humans and the fairies. They were unable to be seen by eyes that were not meant to be seen, and unable to be touched by hands that were not meant to touch them. Of these, the underworld, or netherworld, was Ivalice's spiritual no man's land, the very definition of purgatory. It was created to highlight the power of the Ajora, establishing consequences for those who dared to challenge them. Sinister, powerful creatures who had broken the laws of the land were therefore banished from the other realms and sent to the underworld as punishment for their transgressions. And if the underworld was akin to a prison, the Imperial Plane was a resting place for the departed souls of Ivalice. After death in the mortal realm, spirits eventually found their way there, and though not a place of eternal torment or darkness, it was nonetheless a one-way trip for most who found their way to the land of the dead. Finally, in the space between the other three realms lay the world of illusion. This was a place of great magic and mystery created by the Ajora to serve as a fountain and vessel for knowledge and power. It was from the world of illusion that the Scions were born, as the Ajora drew from ether that existed beyond time and space, before manifesting it into physical beings of immense power. The Ajora, now content with their work and having some Scions to back up their claims of authority, believed they had created a self-sufficient utopia. But it wasn't long before their master plan began to unravel. Soon after the Ajora had congratulated themselves for creating such an intricate design where everything was supposed to live in relative peace and harmony, their new creations began to rebel, and in ways that were far more severe than the threat posed by humanity. The first instance of this was that of the dragon-god conflict. Having grown tired of serving as the Ajora's lapdogs and being tasked with the boring job of guarding the environments of the world, the dragons became restless with their roles and sought something better. And being the apex predators that they were, the dragons set designs on their creators, sensing that the time for revolution was nigh. For the Ajora, this posed quite the issue. They had purposely made the dragons extremely powerful so that they would be very effective at completing the task assigned to them. They had also naively thought that this power, due to the existence of the scions, would not be turned against them. The only advantage afforded to the Ajora was that though strong, the dragons were not particularly smart or organised. Tacticians, they were not. As a result, the dragons, who acted as a team of individuals, were outsmarted and bested by the Ajora. Throughout the conflict, sides were drawn. The fairies, for example, supported the gods, and in the aftermath rose in standing as preferential children of the Ajora. On the other side, the dragons, who had played a key role in the uprising, found themselves sealed within rings as punishment, placed around their necks as literal symbols of their imprisonment and servitude to the gods. These great rings inhibited their powers, such as diminishing elemental affinities or removing their power of flight, but they were still designed to provide a degree of freedom. After all, the Ajora still needed some of the dragons to continue carrying out their duties. They were just to be a bit nullified. The worst offenders, however, saw themselves not only outfitted with sealed rings, but banished to the underworld for their crimes, and one prominent example was the Hellworm. Not all dragons took part in the uprising, however, opting instead to stick to their duties. These included the likes of the Elder Worm, one of the oldest dragons in Ivalice. But even they did not escape the Ajora's wrath. Though rings were not used, the Ajora made sure to inhibit their powers and influence in other ways. The Ajora believed that the problem with the dragons had manifested by creating too many creatures of similar levels of strength. What they needed was a new creature that embodied the same objective, and this led to the introduction of an even stronger apex predator called Yizmat. It was designed to be the alpha dragon, able to keep its peers in check, and with Yizmat being a singular entity, the Ajora believed that there would be no more problems with collusion, and this was an important detail. Though the dragon uprising had been quelled, the fact remained that the Ajora had created a collective they had lost control of. Singular beings were much easier to marshal, and this was a lesson they learnt well. The Ajora had succeeded in their first major test, but they had been fooled by their own hubris. The conflict needn't have happened. After all, the dragons were beings of the Ajora's own creation. But by tackling this problem, the Ajora had been distracted from their main task, controlling humanity. And the irony around this was that the dragons, like nearly every single action taken by the Ajora up until this point, had been created to help them with the fulfillment of that task. It meant the Ajora had made the same huge mistake as Arnis. They had underestimated humanity's power of free will and thought. As it turned out, the Ajora's masterful plans weren't as ironclad as they had assumed. Instead of being inhibited and beaten down by the layers upon layers of obstacles dumped on top of them, humanity, as it had done before, had simply adapted to the new conditions they had been presented with, and had begun to cultivate heavensward ambitions once again. Instead of just surviving in the brutal chaos of the world the Ajora had made, which was the plan, humanity thrived and prospered. What the Ajora failed to realise was that humans were very different from the races they had manufactured. As individuals, humans were weak. A single dragon could likely take down hundreds without batting an eyelid. This notion blindsided the Ajora as it had done Arnis. They failed to understand that the power of humans came in their ability to connect. As a collective, they overcame their deficiencies to become powerful, tenacious, and incredibly intelligent. The way the Ajora had tried to deal with the problem was akin to a giant trying to wipe out a colony of ants by stepping on them. The solution was never going to work, and their vivarium experiment had failed. Undeterred, the Ajora came up with an alternative plan, one they believed would be far more effective. This saw them try to inhibit large swaths of humanity at once as a preemptive measure. This, they hoped, would reduce the ability for humanity to challenge them in the same way the dragons had attempted previously. Numerous options were considered, but the Ajora settled on a disaster that became known as the Calamity of Earth. This disaster was designed to punish humanity for their own hubris in challenging the gods, whether knowingly or otherwise. An ironic proposition given how the Ajora thought of themselves. The idea was to take the humans away from what the Ajora believed they treasured most, the home they had cultivated over all these years. Wrested from the combined realms and relative life of ease they had created for themselves, the Calamity of Earth banished humans to a separate realm within the mortal plane of Evilise. Places they previously had access to, such as the holy city of Guravagan, were removed from them, placed out of reach. This meant humans were made to live out the remainder of eternity without the same access and grace of the gods they had previously enjoyed. This diminished their relationship with the higher powers, but also inhibited their ability to challenge the Ajora and their broader plans for Evilise. With man now seemingly placated and sealed in the mortal realm in a specific area, again the Ajora rested on their laurels, and again they grew too comfortable with their supposed victory. But they were now well aware that even their best laid plans could go awry, and this caused them to prepare for future uprisings should they occur. And this was where the Scions came in. Each was designed for a specific purpose, and they were to fulfill that purpose indefinitely, without any hope of reprieve. Exodus, for example, was the oldest of the Scion, created in opposition to Halmarat, the Arbiter. It was tasked with presiding over everything that Evilise encompassed, acting as the ultimate extension of the Ajora. This meant Exodus was judge, jury, and executioner, all rolled into one. But as this role was quite broad and difficult to manage, it required the creation of other Scions to manage more specific tasks. Matthias, for example, was created by the Ajora to serve as the ruler and protector of the underworld, there to make sure all the prisoners sent there by the likes of either the Ajora or Exodus were kept in line. Each of the Scions were made to be powerful and intelligent, so as to be able to accomplish their tasks with a high degree of respect, dignity, and autonomy. But they were not infallible. Many started yearning for more, as their lives became thankless and mundane due to the sheer monotony of the tasks they had been given and the lack of fulfillment that was forthcoming. It was clear to them that the Ajora were overseers who had little care or compassion for their own creations. They were there to do a job and be thankful they even existed at all. Matthias was the first of the Scion to become aware of the thankless nature of the task at hand, something that was perhaps influenced by the company they were forced to keep. It's unclear how long it took or when it happened, but having succumbed to avarice, Matthias ended up imprisoning the powerful elemental spirit of Shiva and transmuting her into his own body. Matthias' plan was then to use this extreme power as an extension of its own in order to rebel against the Ajora. And this did give Matthias an edge, but as the rebellion was a solo effort, the Ajora were able to quell it with relative ease, and Matthias was banished to the very place he was tasked with protecting, thrown into the depths of hell for all eternity. The next to follow a similar path was Adramelech, who was seemingly created as a direct replacement for Matthias. The Ajora did not want to repeat though, so they gave Adramelech more power and more authority, hoping it would quell any insecurities that may exist. But this ended up backfiring as the Scion was too effective at its role. Instead of quieting the underworld and bringing its inhabitants to order, Adramelech bent their wills and turned them into his followers. With a small army by its side, Adramelech then sought to challenge the Ajora, just like Matthias had done so before, but he too was found wanting. And just like Matthias, Adramelech was defeated and punished for his insubordination. These isolated rebellions were an annoyance for the Ajora, but they had somewhat expected them due to the nature of the Scions. What they did not expect, however, was for their most powerful creations to start joining forces in a meaningful way. Amongst all of the Scions created by the Ajora, one of the most important outside of Exodus and Halmarat was Ultima, the High Seraph. Whereas Matthias and Adramelech had been given roles that seemed prestigious, but were in reality undesirable due to the nature of the required tasks involved in carrying out their functions, Ultima, by contrast, was given a truly decorated occupation. They were to act as the guide for souls heading for the Imperial Plane, there to assist with the process of reincarnation. Neither a scion of the darkness or of the light, Ultima encompassed the aspects of both. and she revelled in this role, taking great pleasure and pride in the importance of that which had been bestowed on her. But, just like the other scions, she too eventually found herself fundamentally altered by the task assigned to her, and this happened for two distinct reasons. Other dark scions had been created alongside the likes of Matius and Adramelech, and they had each been tasked with doing the jobs that the Acuria did not want to do themselves, because they either felt it was beneath them, or meant their hands would get proverbially dirty. There was no care given to the fate or well-being of the dark scions. They were sacrificial pawns in the Acuria's twisted game of presiding over Ivalice and controlling humanity. Ultima felt this was wrong, not least because from her vantage point, she could see that the light scions had not been subjected to the same level of denigration. Thus, she chose to become the White Knight, the one who would stand up for the Dark Scions and oppose their harsh treatment by the Acuria. This then worked hand in hand with Ultima's own ambitions. Having been given the power over life and death across Ivalice, Ultima believed herself to be destined for more. She would therefore not only stand up for her fellow scions, she would replace the Acuria and be a much better and more compassionate ruler. But despite her confidence, Ultima was not arrogant or delusional. She was well aware of the power of the Acuria, and she knew that if she stood alone, as Matius and Adramelech had done before, there was no chance of her gambit succeeding. Ultima deduced that they had failed by placing reliance on lesser beings, such as elemental spirits or the fiends of the overworld that the Acuria had themselves created. She therefore sought to recruit her fellow scions, because together they would be much more likely to come out on top. Starting with the new keeper of the underworld, Shemhazai, and the overseer of mankind, Hashmal, Ultima began sowing the seeds of rebellion amongst those the Acuria had trusted most to uphold the balance of all things in Ivalice. And they then made their ambitious attempt against the Acuria. What followed was a brutal and taxing conflict. The Acuria had been able to deal with the separate uprisings of Matius and Adramelech due to the smaller scale and isolated nature of the conflicts, but the Ultima Rebellion was an altogether different beast. Not only did the Acuria have to deal with the combined might of their most powerful creations, but they also had to contend with their biggest weakness being exposed, the requirement placed upon them by Arnus to keep humanity in check. It's unclear how Shemhazai became aware of this weakness, but she revealed it to Ultima once plans for rebellion were announced. And when the time was right, Shemhazai left her fellow scions and descended upon the land, where, in the absence of Hashmal, she freely sowed evil, manipulating humanity and teaching them how to reap new kinds of destruction against itself. The Scions' united front and the rise of humanity was unprecedented, and it took centuries, if not millennia, for the Acuria to wrestle back control of Ivalice. Chapter 2: The Age of Men. Quelling the Ultima Rebellion ended up being an enormous struggle for the Acuria, and achieving victory came at a great cost. For her crimes, Ultima was sentenced to a rather poetic punishment to match her title. Like Arnus had done to Zabam, the Acuria locked Ultima in an eternal death and rebirth cycle. Perpetually, for all of eternity, she was fated to be born into the body of a random human and forced to live a mortal life over and over again. Those who had joined her cause as renegade scions were given similar treatment, sealed inside small crystals known as orosite. The orosite severely limited the autonomy of the scions it captured, with numerous seals being put in place to prevent their escape, but their power was not taken away. If a being, like say a human, got their hands on a piece of orosite, the scion's power sealed within could be activated, making orosite a very dangerous artifact indeed. So the Acuria made sure the orosite were well hidden and ideally well guarded. This treatment bred further resentment against the Acuria amongst the remaining scions, but they could do nothing but bide their time and wait for the right moment to break free and seek retribution. The Acuria, although satisfied with the resolution, then had to deal with the fallout across Ivalice itself. And when they brought their gaze back to the mortal realm and saw how the seeds that Shemhazai had sown had sprouted, They were enraged. Humanity had taken full advantage of the chaos, and the land they had been given was now rife with conflict and turmoil. The Ajora were close to failing the task they had been set by Arnus. With everything the Ajora had attempted to cultivate on the brink of collapse, they were forced to propose a new plan, and this plan could not fail. It became clear that putting forth something akin to the previous Calamity would no longer be severe enough. Humanity had only been temporarily hindered that time, and after a period of adjustment had grown to become unfazed by their isolation. Now though, they had grown well above their station. With the aid of Shemhazai, humanity believed they too had the power to be gods, and the Ajora felt it was time to remind them of their place in the universe. Their new plan was to make that place very clear, and it was called the Calamity of Light. In the past, the Ajora had attempted to control the lives and actions of humanity directly, either through complex natural hierarchies or more directly through the use of scions. But this always led back to the same problem. The Ajora themselves still needed to be directly involved, because when they weren't, humanity took advantage of their absence to tip the odds in their favour and wrest control of Ivalice. The most recent example was also the most extreme, and it was countered by a solution that was devilishly simple. The Ajora wanted humanity to feel as though they were constantly being watched and judged by the gods. They hoped to create faith. This was to then act as a precondition for dogma, which they hoped humanity would use to police itself. The Ajora could then pull the strings from behind the scenes, tweaking this dogma to ensure humanity was kept on its toes. And because the previous growth of humanity had happened under the watchful eye of a scion who had chosen to abandon their duties, creating another scion to enact this plan was not deemed an effective measure. The Ajora instead created diakon entites, bright elementals that were there to shine a proverbial light on man and remind them of the constant judgment of holy righteousness. The diakon entites then gave the Ajora the room to operate on a multitude of levels. They wanted humanity to think that it was in control, but with fear of reprisal. This, they hoped, would then remove their ability to prosper, as humans would aim to be subservient, with a natural culling occurring that was self-policing whenever anyone stepped out of line. On paper, the Calamity of Light was meant to benefit the Ajora, but the reality ended up being quite different. The initial period worked well. Humanity started to model their lives around the new commandments, and the diakon entites reminded them that their faith was being recognized. As intended, this then dovetailed with a degree of self-policing, as communities formed and punishments were created for those who deviated. Everything seemed to be going well. That was until the strength of humanity came to the fore and surprised the Ajora yet again. Even though some communities were happy to accept this new way of life and interpreted everything in the expected manner, others chose to take a different path. Some opted to interpret everything in more extreme or less extreme ways, with some communities even opting to just not partake. They didn't care about what the diakon entites represented. These deviations then led to conflict, as each group felt they were correct in their interpretation, or indeed lack of interpretation. And over the next few decades, as specific schools of thought grew and became more prevalent, these small communities also grew as people rallied around specific ideologies and beliefs. Unlike before, where humanity were attempting to survive against the new creatures created by the Ajora, or were corrupted by Shemhazai into delving into their darker emotions such as greed, humanity was now competing against each other based on inherent beliefs. During this period, only the most cunning and powerful communities survived. The Ajora had unknowingly created an extreme interpretation of survival of the fittest, and it was all based around religion. Despite their best efforts, they had only served to make humanity a greater threat than they ever were before. This result dismayed the Ajora. How could such a well thought out plan backfire in such a catastrophic manner? Realizing they only had themselves to blame, the Ajora attempted to solve the problem with yet another calamity, except this time it was to be more direct. Both the Calamity of Earth and the Calamity of Light were quite passive in their implementation. The Curia simply removed or introduced something that was designed to change the way humanity thought or acted. But with neither having the desired effect, the Curia decided that the best way to deal with insects was to go full scorched earth, and this was not a figurative ideal. To oversee this new calamity, the Curia utilised a heinous scion called Belias. Its objective was to punish the humans for their transgressions, to raise the mortal realm of Ivalice by covering it in a sea of flame. Under Belias' command, fire elementals known as firemanes set the land ablaze, destroying countless cities and civilizations and burning forests all across the land. This became known as the Calamity of Fire, and there were massive casualties. Again though, humanity persisted through their punishment and began to rebuild. The Curia, when they saw this, were astounded and frustrated in equal measure. They had created a harsh environment, but the will of humanity refused to be broken. Thus, they created another calamity. This time, the Curia plunged Ivalice into a prolonged ice age, designed to time out humanity and reduce their numbers even more while also prohibiting their growth. The Calamity of Ice, much like the previous calamities, proved successful at first. Humanity struggled to survive, their civilizations collapsed, and their populations dropped dramatically. But this time, the effective period lasted much longer, and the Curia believed they had found their solution. With Ivalice effectively on pause, they were then able to leave the mortal realm to focus on the other worlds, as they were confident that when they returned their attention back to the mortal realm, things would be more or less as they left them. This lasted for a period of nearly 1,000 years, and their assertion proved to be true until it didn't. Almost as if an act of defiance from the land itself, as though willed by Zabam, Mount Golg erupted unexpectedly, and the glaciers that covered Ivalice began to melt as the climate heated up again. Humanity was able to rebuild and continue their conquest of Ivalice, now more hardy than ever before. Once again, the Curia found themselves in the same situation. How could they possibly reign over this ever-tenacious invention of Arnus? After much deliberation, they concluded that past attempts to control humanity were more of temporary inconveniences than lasting solutions. So they began to plan more extreme solutions that the land itself could not undo. Before the Curia were then able to enact their next plan, however, they began to notice an interesting series of events playing out in the human world that they thought might do the job for them. So they decided to observe, biding their time and watching carefully. Human civilization had, following Ivalice's thaw, began to advance faster than it ever had previously, and throughout the world, technology and magic flourished, taking humanity to greater and greater heights. In the east, this period saw the rise of 7 great and independent kingdoms, known as Fotherham, Lionel, Limbury, Lassalia, Gallio and Zeltenia, and Mulond. As each was a local force in their own right, it was not long until humanity's penchant for avarice crept into the relationships that existed between these kingdoms and soured them. Soon, all 7 began to eye the territories of their neighbours. What started out as small local skirmishes soon grew into full-on wars between the 7 kingdoms, and as humanity progressed, these wars leveraged new technologies to become increasingly more deadly. Several centuries passed, and what felt like endless battles resulted in no lasting victories. Nobody had the strength and conviction to do what needed to be done. That was until a new king ascended to the throne of Mulond with great ambitions. He was not driven simply by expansion. He was instead driven by a plan to secure peace, to stop the endless fighting. But to do this, he would need to unite the 7 kingdoms under a single banner. Convinced that this was the only way to end the centuries of war, the king thus began pouring resources into anything that might bring him the outcome he so desired. For a while, his efforts bore no fruit, but then, by chance, an answer to his problems appeared in the most peculiar of forms. Knowing that he stood little chance in the current arms race against the other kingdoms, The King of Malond had begun to look into ways to magically skew the odds in his favour, and what his research returned was akin to bringing a gun to a knife fight. Dabbling in arcane, forbidden magic that had long been thought lost, the King of Malond gained the ability to summon a demon from the Netherworld, Ivalice's spiritual no man's land that humanity was believed to have been disconnected from. After careful preparation, the plan was executed, and the demon was summoned. But an immediate issue arose. The King of Malond assumed the demon was to be subservient to whomever summoned it, but it became clear, very quickly, that the demon had no intention of listening to the commands of a pathetic human. The king was soon butchered, and seeing an empty throne, the demon wasted no time in claiming Malond for itself and picking up where the king had left off. Except this time, the ambition was much greater. The demon didn't want the Seven Kingdoms. It wanted the world, and it wanted to destroy it. What followed was a dark period for humanity, and for a time, though a demon had escaped the Netherworld, the Ajora watched from afar silently, curious to see if this might help solve some of their problems relating to humanity. After all, maybe they wouldn't need more calamities if this demon helped to keep them in check. To the citizens of the Seven Kingdoms, however, this new reality was a hell on earth, and monsters and demons began to roam freely, killing whomever they pleased. For a moment, all hope seemed lost, until one fateful day when someone stood up to the tyranny of the demon. You see, humanity hadn't only discovered arcane magics in the time since the thaw of Ivalice, they had also rediscovered the Orosite, the powerful stones that had long lay hidden in the world. But when channeled by those strong-willed enough to resist the influence, they granted the users unimaginable powers, the likes of which had never been seen before. And so a hero rose up, surrounded by 12 disciples, each bearing a piece of Orosite aligned with one of the 12 zodiac symbols. These heroes became known as the Zodiac Braves, and by combining their powers, they were able to successfully banish the demon and its minions back to the Netherworld, and in doing so, became the saviors of Ivalice. The threat now eradicated, peace in the Seven Kingdoms had finally been achieved, at least for a time. So, no longer needed by the world, the Zodiac Braves disappeared into history, and along with them, so too did the Orosite. The story soon gained traction though, and before long, tales of the mysterious heroes known as the Zodiac Braves were known all over the world. Humanity had avoided another disaster, and the actions of the Zodiac Braves had caught the attention of the Ajora. With the failure of the demons to keep the humans in check, and concerned by this new power the humans had access to, the Ajora returned to preparing contingencies, and as they did, humanity flourished even more, now creating great technologies that harnessed the wind and allowed industry to propagate and destroy the ecology of Ivalice. So the Ajora enacted the Calamity of Wind to target these advancements. They wanted to strip humanity of the gift of wind, seeking to throw a large wrench into the spokes of the technology the humans had created and subsequently started to pollute the world of Ivalice with. Following the events of the Zodiac Braves and the demon, this pollution had become an even bigger concern for the Ajora than humanity itself, as it had accelerated the degradation of the land more than had been intended. And this threatened to bring an abrupt end to Zabarm's eternal punishment if left unchecked. They were therefore pleased that the Calamity of Wind seemed to be a success. But once more, it did not take long for the inventiveness of humanity to shine through. They built newer technologies that polluted even more than before without requiring the wind, outsmarting the arrogant Ajora yet again. By this time, the patience of the Ajora was wearing very thin. They needed a lasting solution to the problem humanity presented, and with their next calamity, the Ajora were sure they had finally cracked the code. This led to the creation of the Calamity of Water. As humanity's pollution had continued to spread, it could no longer be ignored, and the Ajora needed a means of cleansing the land. To do so, they entrusted the Scion Kahulain with the task of engineering a great flood that could cover the land, setting back the efforts of humanity by sinking it to the bottom of the cleansing waters. Like the other calamities, the Calamity of Water was again extremely successful at first. Many civilizations in Ivalice were devastated as a result of Cahulain's flood, and much of the knowledge of technology and magic were lost to time, setting humanity back. Once again, however, the Calamity of Water didn't quite go as planned. For the second part of the Calamity, Cahulain was meant to absorb all the pollution of humanity into itself. But this created an unfortunate byproduct, as Cahulain became corrupted and twisted by the impurities it was sent to take care of. The issue posed by this development was not obvious to the Ajora at first, as it simply appeared as though Cahulain had excelled in its task. But as the floodwaters receded and humanity began to bounce back, it quickly became apparent that something had gone awry. Cahulain had morphed into something else, a deity of pestilence. It now acted as an incubator for terrible diseases that threatened humanity beyond the extent of the original plan. These diseases spread far and wide, and the already suffering populations of Ivalice were hurt even more, as the humans had no defense against this new kind of threat. This was a problem for the Ajora. The Calamity of Water had been successful in reducing both the pollution of the world and the human populations, but the diseases spread by Cahulain were too effective, and the populations were being culled too quickly. The Ajora had simply needed the progress of humanity to be limited while enacting a soft reset of the land itself, but they did not want to outright annihilate humanity. This meant there was little recourse but to try and fix the problem they had created. It just wasn't simple. And while the Ajora toiled away trying to find that solution, life on Ivalice continued as humanity attempted to overcome this latest struggle. In the ages that followed, many a kingdom rose and fell, and this was due, in large part, to the lingering effects of Cahulain's pestilence. The kingdom of Ajora was once such a kingdom that rose to prominence during the aftermath of the Calamity of Water, and for a lengthy period enjoyed its time in the sun. Growing large enough to cover a good portion of Ivalice, its people prospered, and though illnesses were present, for the most part, its people lived in a relative state of prosperity. However, this was not to last. Eventually, an illness known as smallpox, a disease more deadly than any that had come before it, arose and devastated the people of Ajora. Though the smallpox epidemic did not wipe Ajora out, it did weaken its position in the world, making it more prone to attacks from the other kingdoms that were vying for the prominence it held. To make matters worse, another disease called Ebola soon took smallpox's place, wreaking havoc throughout the kingdom and weakening it even further. As a result of this 1-2 punch of epidemics, the kingdom of Ronka saw an opportunity to surpass its old rival in influence and power and began to press its advantage. Hanging on by a thread in nearly every measurable way, Ajora was on life support, as its territories were just one more run of bad luck away from falling to the rising star of the Ronkan Empire. And, as had seemed to be the lot of humans in Ivalice, this bad luck was destined to continue, as yet another epidemic hit the severely injured Ajora, this time taking the form of measles. The third plague proved to be the final nail in the coffin for Ajora, as with this latest epidemic, it was no longer able to hold on to its territory or people, and the Ronkan Empire overtook them once and for all, assuming control of all former Ajoran territory. For a moment, it seemed that Ronka was incapable of failure, and that this new world order would persist. But as was always the case with Ivalice, sometimes the wheel of fortune spun faster than one assumed, and those on top quickly found themselves at the bottom again. Out of the disease-ridden and smouldering remains of Ajora, a new empire was forming, slowly but surely, and it was doing so alongside a newer power. These two entities came to be known as the Holy Ajoran Empire and the Palamecian Empire, and both quickly grew to become important civilizations in Ivalice. Unfortunately, both empires also came about around the same time as the fourth major epidemic caused by Cahulain's pestilence, the bubonic plague. Spread by vermin and then quickly from host to host, the plague ravaged the entire world and seemed to bypass all the conventions of medicine that had previously been established to combat the epidemics of the past. As a result, again, many people died. But this time, civilization persisted through sheer will and a shared knowledge of reducing the spread of disease through quarantine. Throughout all of this, the Ajora were still at a loss with regards to the illnesses that plagued humanity. But after a while, they came to appreciate how effective they were at culling the population, appearing at just the right cadence and killing just the right amount of people. It meant the initial failure of Cahulain ended up being seen as a success, as it did a better job of achieving the Akura's objectives than any of their previous calamities. But as a result, this era of Ivalice's history was a tumultuous time. Whereas many of the previous calamities had been singular issues, disease was persistent. It seemed like there was no help, divine or otherwise, coming to aid them in their struggles to survive, resulting in many looking far and wide for any sort of sign or direction through the darkness that was consuming them. And it was during this dark period that Ivalice saw many of its denizens turn not only to organised religion for answers, as many had done in the past following the Calamity of Light, but to prophets and seers. The Calamity of Light was being combined with the Calamity of Pestilence, and it led to the birth of extremism. Chapter 3. The Saint known as Ajora. As humanity struggled to deal with what felt like a near endless stream of blights, people turned to things that they hoped might ease their suffering or help them seek salvation. The Diaconentites had ushered in this kind of thinking, and as the Calamity of Pestilence grew in its severity, so too did the impact of the Calamity of Light and the Diaconentites. The bubonic plague led to a tumultuous and torrid period, and to ease their mental anguish, people turned to the dominant religion at the time, which was known as Pharism. This was a religious order whose centre of power was in the city of Melond. Pharism also served as the main religion of the Holy Adoran Empire, giving its clergy immense political and societal influence. This influence was near absolute. They branded all dissidents as heretics, removing everyone and anyone who dared to stand up against them. It meant Pharism had a firm grasp on the lives of the people of the Empire and much of Ivalice. In less trying times, these dogmatic convictions would have pushed people away. But due to how much uncertainty there was, people flocked to the Pharis teachings as they provided a degree of solace, while also giving people clarity. If they performed certain actions, even if times were rough and they were likely to perish, at least their souls would be saved. There was a degree of truth in this. Once upon a time, humanity was an important part of the much broader scope of Ivalice. But the nature and role of humanity had become lost to humanity itself over time. The teachings and doctrine extolled by Pharism were warped and twisted iterations of what once was the reality. For a time, things continued this way. People sought comfort in Pharis teachings, and those who challenged them were reported, removed from the public eye, and never seen again. It felt as though this was the new status quo, but in Ivalice, nothing was everlasting. Before long, the wheel of fortune again began to slowly creak and shift, ushering in a new age, one that started with the birth of a child called Ajora Glabados. Born in the city of Benevia, Ajora was remarkable from the very instant he came into the world. It's reported that he stood upon 2 feet mere moments after birth before walking to a nearby well. Ajora then proceeded to speak, informing the people that the well was poisoned and was to be the origin point of a future plague. The peculiarity and strangeness of this event was not lost on those present that day. Many were impressed at the infant Ajora's abilities to stand and talk after just being born, but none were especially convinced of the warning given despite these miraculous events. After all, how could anyone come to know such a thing, let alone a newborn child who knew nothing of the wider world? But they soon came to be convinced of Ajora's knack for prognostication. As it turned out, years later, a plague did ravage the Holy Adora Empire, and the well, as Ajora had predicted, served as the source of the contamination. The survivors who remembered the used warnings then began to believe that Ajora was a messiah of sorts, sent to deliver them from the evils of the world as a child of the gods. And this gave Ajora a platform. He was henceforth recognized as a prophet. Though modest at first, as he aged, Ajora began to preach more and more, ever expanding his influence and following. His teachings brought comfort to many and attracted people from far and wide who wished to hear his sermons. At first, the Church of Pharism paid little attention. They believed Ajora was actually quite amusing and of no real consequence, just like many others who had attempted to challenge their teachings before. But as the attention grew, Ajora started to become a thorn in the side of the church. His standing amongst the people then made action difficult. They had missed their initial window to deal with the threat. The church therefore had to bide their time and keep a close watch on the young prophet's actions. They had hoped that people would see him for the liar he surely was and come back to the church, like so many people had done so before when false prophets were exposed. That would have then given them the opportunity to persecute Ajora according to the will of the people, as blasphemers were not to be tolerated. But Ajora continued to teach, and his following continued to grow. The church, for their part, were forced to continue to watch, remaining passive. But things changed when Ajora was about 20 years old. His sermons and lectures started to adapt, and they became more singular in their focus. The new topic was paradise, and this was the reason for the church's shift. The prospect of a world without suffering, where everyone had exactly what they needed and there was no fear, was what everyone wanted to hear. After all, life in Ivalice was hard. The church had profited on those hardships. To exist, they needed the people who were suffering to believe that their teachings were the only path to salvation. But Ajora was now promising an alternative path, and due to his previous actions, people were willing to believe what he had to say. This then posed a huge problem for the church, as they were the ones who risked being exposed, because even if Ajora was a phony, it was all about perception. They had enjoyed their spiritual monopoly over the people of Ivalice and were no longer willing to tolerate someone promising them a better life than they could ever offer. After deciding that enough was enough, the Church of Pharism upgraded their concern from passive to active, and this meant enacting plans to either reduce or eliminate Ajora's influence completely, lest he rise up and challenge them with his ever-expanding army of supporters. To aid in this plan, the church sought the help of their close ally, the Holy Ajora Empire. The two powers had coexisted for some time, with the church acting as the spiritual and community body, and the empire there to rule and handle other administrative tasks such as the collection of taxes and the running of the military. Together, they staged an intervention, and Ajora was branded a heretic and a traitor to both the church and the empire. But even though that was his public status, and the sentiment of some citizens was affected, little changed in reality. And this was because Ajora, as it turned out, was not an easy person to track down. He had long been concerned about running afoul of the church, and had numerous safeguards in place should the wrong people ever come looking for him. And through his now vast network of supporters and disciples, Ajora was able to blend into his surroundings and hide in plain sight, at least for a time. Security was difficult, however. With so many followers, it was impossible to trust everyone, and no matter how many followers he had, the church still had more, and they were also much more powerful. In the end, one of Ajora's closest supporters, Germanique, was the one to betray him. He had wanted to believe Ajora, but after the church's declaration, Germanique became frightened at how serious the situation surrounding his preaching had become. Fearing only further escalation, Germanique revealed to the church the location of Ajora's secret hideout, and he was quickly captured following a brief skirmish. Wasting no time, Ajora was sentenced to death, and publicly executed at the Golgotha gallows. Everything had played out just as the church had predicted. Ajora was just another example to those who thought to preach against the church in supposed heresy. Following the death of Ajora, the Church of Pharism and the Holy Ajora Empire assumed their issue had been dealt with. But beneath the surface, resentment started to brew, and the church's fortunes were about to drastically shift in unexpected ways. Not long after Ajora's execution, a massive tidal wave struck the city of Malond. It destroyed the seat of the Church of Pharism and killed an immeasurable number of citizens within the empire. To the followers of Ajora, this was nothing short of divine retribution for the slaying of the so-called messenger of the gods. And despite their prophet no longer being amongst the living, Ajora's teachings were thrust into the spotlight by those who were now convinced of his legitimacy. With its seat of power also lost, the Church of Pharism was now in disarray. They struggled to control public sentiment that was spreading against them, and day after day, while the number of Ajoran supporters grew, theirs started to dwindle. They had sought to destroy Ajora's influence by executing him, but due to how long they had waited, their actions had created the perfect situation for Ajora to become a martyr. And in the chaos following his death, a new church rose to prominence. It was called the Church of Glabados, and it was established to honour Ajora's name and carry on his teachings. This then helped those who were seeking answers in a time of chaos. But unbeknownst to those poor people, and indeed those who sought power at the head of the Church of Pharism, they had been played. While on the surface it all seemed as though Ajora really was a divine figure, the truth was quite different. Because though Ajora was indeed an impressive figure who was capable of great feats beyond those of an ordinary human, he was not quite the prophet or proposed son of the gods he had been made out to be. The human, named Ajora, did indeed live, but what the people saw was simply a husk or a host for something much more powerful, the High Seraph, Ultima. Following her defeat at the hands of the Acuria during the Ultima Rebellion, Ultima and the other Scions of the Dark were stripped of their ability to move freely between the mortal realm and the other worlds. By limiting their power thus, the Acuria hoped to rein in their ambitions and return them to their former subservient roles after their punishments had been served. However, there existed another method for the Scions to traverse the mortal realm, the use of Orosight. These were connected to the myths and legends of the Zodiac Braves, but the 13 pieces of Orosight were not only powerful relics, they were also capable of channeling the Scions into the mortal realm. But they needed human vessels to do so, as without them, they were simply no more than shiny rocks. Useless to the Scions of Dark laying in the ground, when Ultima inhibited her human host, she hoped to use her knowledge to set about a chain reaction. For she had figured out how to break free of the Acuria's mortal prison. The plan was simple. Get the Orosight into the hands of human vessels that were strong enough, and then free the Scions from their shackles. And once they were free at her side, they would challenge the Acuria yet again, escape their grasp, and control their own destinies. At first, collecting the Orosight seemed quite easy. After all the stones had gathered, quite a legend surrounding them. Ajora had sought to gain followers with the hopes of using them to hunt down the stones before then using them to free the Scions. But unfortunately for Ultima, even though some of the Orosight were obtained, her plans as Ajora were rendered null and void. Germanique, seen as a traitor to Ajora's followers, had observed Ajora's actions closely and witnessed acts of sabotage and subterfuge. Despite Ajora attempting to justify these actions, they made Germanique feel uneasy. With his limited knowledge, he came to believe that Ajora was not the son of the gods, but simply a spy from an opposition kingdom. And when he was approached by the Holy Adoran Empire to act as a spy himself and betray Ajora, he did so knowing nothing of Ultima's greater plot. Ironically, Germanique had tried to do what was right, and had inadvertently saved Ivalice from Ultima's true intentions, albeit for a time. But in a twisted way, it turned out that the wider followers of Ajora were also correct about his origins. Melon's destruction did indeed come through divine retribution for Ajora's death. Through the Orosight that Ajora had already located, the Scions of the Dark, now operating under the title of Lucavi, had destroyed Melon for interrupting Ultima's plans. After all, without Ultima, they would be unable to break free from their Orosight prisons, and they therefore needed to wait until she was reborn into a new vessel. They therefore took advantage of the creation of the Church of Glabados in the wake of the disaster. They realised that if they could control what was becoming the most dominant religion in Ivalice, they could manipulate the humans easier through the Orosight. In addition, under the guise of the Church, they could play the factions of humans off each other and sow chaos and war, something that would prove beneficial to their plans to revive Ultima without rousing the suspicions of the Acuria. So, the Lucavi infiltrated and grew the Church of Glabados, possessing powerful humans and even modifying the story of the Zodiac Braves to place Ajora at its heart. They made Ajora the individual that united the heroes against that monster of legend, even though it was a complete fabrication. This clever adoption ensured that the Orosight continued to be passed down and preserved by humanity as holy artifacts, allowing the Lucavi to collect them under the noses of the Acuria and operate in the shadows under the cover of the church. The collapse of the Church of Pharism at the hands of the Lucavi, in turn, led to the direct downfall of the Holy Ajora Empire. The fallout from this event splintered Ivalice yet again, and flung the mortal realm into a period of prolonged uncertainty, political infighting, and war. And throughout, the Church of Glabados prospered, becoming more and more essential to the people of Ivalice. Eventually, the uncertainty again ended, and the Wheel of Fortune smiled upon the people of Ivalice, providing a period of relative stability after years of war between the various empires jockeying for the top spot after the fall of the Holy Ajora Empire. This period became known as the Enlightenment, and saw the victor of all this fighting, the Palamecian Empire, at the top of its game. But just as was the case over the course of the history of Ivalice, a human empire being at the top of the world could only mean that disaster lurked around the corner, and this time it was to be no different. Chapter 4: The Calamity of Gravity. After centuries upon centuries of strife, humanity began to find itself. They reached new technological heights and started to impose themselves upon Ivalice in new ways. The Acuria were unimpressed. Because humanity was no longer a simple nuisance, they were now being harmful and reductive. The original challenge posed to them by Arnus, and then by proxy their overlords Persilus and Metzelus, was to find a way to stem the collective tenacity and propagation of humans. For if left unchecked, Ivalice would be ruined, and the eternal torment Arnus had planned for Zabarm would be no more. The Acuria believed the task a simple one, but time after time they were left frustrated by humanity. Numerous calamities have been enacted to try and slow their progress or punish them for transgressions, and they each worked to a point. Humanity was often subdued before either outlasting the calamity or finding a solution to the problem it created. The most successful period for the Acuria, however, had come from a calamity they did not even plan, the calamity of pestilence. But even though it was very effective, the calamity of pestilence pushed humanity too far towards the brink. Remnants of previous calamities were then amplified, and humanity started to act in ways the Acuria had definitely not anticipated. It meant that whereas before the issue was just that humans adapted to the calamities, this time they didn't just adapt. This time humanity prospered. With such swift technological advancements being made, the Acuria became concerned that if the trajectory continued, humanity may not just pose unintentional problems to Ivalice. They could instead grow to challenge them, just like the Scions had attempted before. And due to the volume of humans, this, if left unchecked, could prove fatal. Thus, the Acuria designed and implemented a brand new calamity, known as the Calamity of Gravity. Summoning great meteors from beyond the stars, the Acuria used the Calamity of Gravity to rain down judgment upon the mortal realm. And it was devastating. Though the Acuria had used the calamities of fire and ice in the past to cause widespread destruction, not to mention the still lingering effects of the calamity of water and its inadvertent plagues from the calamity of pestilence, these all paled in comparison to the calamity of gravity's Armageddon. Lasting for quite some time, whole cities were destroyed, and once proud nations were wiped out by the falling celestial bodies. Nearly every technological advancement humanity had accomplished, from the age of the Holy Ajora Empire through to the time of Enlightenment, was wiped out. Airships that had once flown the skies, and advanced medical and industrial capabilities that enabled humanity to prosper, they now lay in smouldering ruins. Those who were lucky enough to withstand the onslaught were left with the meagerest of scraps with which to rebuild society. So horrible and horrific was the damage caused by the calamity of gravity that it was even given a specific name by those who survived: the Cataclysm. But even though the destruction caused during the Cataclysm was severe, with even the terrain of Ivalice heavily altered as a result, this calamity stood out from the Acuria's previous efforts for another reason. Wary of assigning more tasks to the Scions in light of the Ultima Rebellion, the Acuria instead went about this job on their own, opting to take back control of the very situation they had let get away from them. Unfortunately, the side effect of this indiscriminate devastation the Ajora had summoned was that their carefully designed and balanced ecosystems were also caught in the crossfire. As a result, many of Ivalice's more delicate magical races were collateral damage, eliminated without trace. Not able to fend for themselves in the same way as races such as the dragons, both in the chaos of the cataclysm and the fallout that followed, races like Mughals and fairies were seemingly eradicated. This was somewhat sad for the Ajora, but it was deemed a necessary evil. Humanity had to be brought to heel, but not outright defeated, lest they bring about the wrath of their own creators. Broken down and beaten beyond recognition, humanity was left with little to work with. But still, there were players making big moves in the ruins of civilization and the shadow of the cataclysm. And some of the central figures were the Lucavi, those dark scions that had been sealed away by the Ajora for their crimes as part of the Ultima Rebellion. They had managed to come through the cataclysm unscathed, and sought to continue to influence humanity's actions, something that had now been made even easier due to the necessary rebuilding humanity was forced to undergo. It meant even though the technologies of humanity were annihilated, the Church of Glabados endured. It persisted as the one major source of stability in what was otherwise an age of instability. In these dark times, the Church of Glabados was able to offer the people of Ivalice solace in the absence of technological marvels, and Ivalice, as a result, saw an explosion in devout religious practices. This played right into the hands of the Dark Scions. They now had access to a dedicated following that allowed them to push forward with their long-term plans to revive Ultima, and bide their time until that goal was possible. Because of how they were operating though, the Ajora were none the wiser, and as the Scions planned and acted on the scale of decades and centuries, this in turn provided humanity ample time again to rebuild and recreate civilization. Fundamental to the Dark Scions' plans was their impartiality. Instead of building and operating a super powerful nation-state that could easily be targeted, they toiled away behind the scenes, using the cover of the Church of Glabados to influence proceedings, until, of course, it was the right time to act. This impartiality also gave them the ability, if they so chose, to influence multiple nations at the same time. And with the great empires of the Enlightenment era now lying in ruin, the void of power created an opportunity. After all, humanity was ambitious. It was only a matter of time before people stepped in to try and take advantage, and when they did, the Dark Scions would be there, ready and waiting. In portions of Ivalice, there still existed trace remnants of the now long gone Roncan, Palamecian and Holy Ajora empires. Attempts were made to carry on the mantle of these once great civilizations, but most of these were not successful, and their names quickly faded into obscurity, lost to the sands of time and becoming largely forgotten. One that did not suffer the same fate, however, was the Kashka dynasty. A much smaller power than the Roncan, Palamecian and Holy Ajora empires, the Kashka dynasty was a regional power based on the continent of Lore, and its capital was the great city of Eureka. Prior to the Cataclysm, it had enjoyed a position of relative comfort, but like many of the other nations, its capital was reduced to ruins under the full weight of the Calamity of Gravity. In the period that followed, those that held on to their Kashkan lineage dreamed of restoring their dynasty to prominence. Like the rest of humanity, they knew that the road to achieving their goal was to be fraught with peril in this new and dangerous world, but where others failed, they would succeed. And after claiming back enough land to make themselves worthy, the remnants branded themselves the Akasha Empire as a way of paying tribute to their lineage, while also highlighting that they were very much their own people. Their next goal was to try and reclaim as much of the former Kashka dynasty as possible, and with Lore in a state of anarchy, they waged a campaign of hope and reunification, with the objective of expanding their territory and solidifying their rule. To those who opposed them, they spoke of needing to bring order to their region in its time of need. And while some certainly believed in what the Akasha Empire was trying to achieve, and in turn were convinced of the strength of a unification, others were more resistant to kissing the Akashan ring and submitting. These antagonists, as they were labelled, were perhaps upset that their own bids for regional dominance had failed, so they chose to fight back instead. What followed was a brief campaign of localized conflicts that erupted across the region. In the end, though, whether the people submitted willingly or through force, the Akasha Empire was successful in their efforts. Law was united under one banner. Following this, despite some lingering resentment, the Akasha Empire was true to their word. Peace did prevail over their portion of the land. But as with any peace, this ended up being finite. Internal power struggles began to appear amongst those who felt the empire had become stagnant, and a desire for change and revolution started to emerge. Looking to placate those dissenting voices and reunite the people behind a single cause, while also retaining the peace they craved within their own realm, the leadership proposed raids on foreign lands. And this saw the Akasha Empire cast their eyes across the sea. Akashan raiders soon began naval excursions, taking what wasn't theirs through skirmishes with the locals who already inhabited the lands to the east. In the end, it's believed locals who were based in the region of Gallione ended up making a deal to try and stem the tide. They proposed allowing some of the Akashan raiders to settle, and in exchange for land, those settled raiders were to cease aggressive posturing against the locals and provide protection along their stretch of the coastline, designed to thwart raiders from other aggressors. This was a novel proposal. Claiming land had never been the objective, the raids were merely a device used to satiate unruly members of the court. But this presented an opportunity for real growth and expansion. And it meant the Akasha Empire could send those same unruly members of the court far away from the capital, giving them the responsibility of overseeing this new venture. Thus, the terms were accepted. And after cementing their position, the Akasha Empire established the Kingdom of Ivalice, an autonomous state that was to serve as an extension of the empire on this faraway land. It felt like a nice, neat resolution. But those who were placed in charge of the Kingdom of Ivalice found that the continent to the east was much more alive and active than their own region of law. Empires similar to the Akasha Empire had also been emerging from the wreckage of the Cataclysm. This meant that even though the Akashans had made great strides in establishing and growing their own domain, so too had many other powers in their own domains. And it was only a matter of time before they began to test each other's limits. To the east of the Kingdom of Ivalice, there lay various entities. Lionel, for example, was a remnant of the Holy Adoran Empire that was attempting to rekindle its former glory. They were quickly assimilated into the Kingdom of Ivalice. And this then introduced the Church of Glabados to the Akashan Empire. Lionel was then joined by many other smaller powers, including Lassalia and Zoltenia. But further east lay a much bigger beast, the Kingdom of Ordalia. Early on in the Kingdom of Ivalice's establishment, numerous skirmishes erupted between these two powers as boundaries were being tested. But after an initial period, things cooled off, and the two powers decided to remain cordial. There was a sense that neither the Kingdom of Ivalice, and by proxy the Akashan Empire, nor the Kingdom of Ordalia wanted to provoke each other and bring about such a large-scale conflict. Over time, this notion only became more pronounced, as even though the ruler of the Kingdom of Ivalice was of Akashan blood, they had grown distant from the main empire that was based on law, and this weakened its position. To ensure peace, the Kingdom of Ivalice therefore entered formal alliances with the Kingdom of Ordalia and other powers in the region, all with the hopes of ensuring guarantees of mutual sovereignty. The royal families and nobles of these lands partook in political marriages and stewardships, and this led to the King of Ordalia ending up as the nephew of the King of Ivalice. But Ivalice and Ordalia were not alone in the region. Other smaller nations existed. The trade city of Salgidos, for example, served as a regional centre of commerce, and another, smaller, independent nation existed between the two great states, called Zalmonia. Tiny by comparison, Zalmonia enjoyed the benefits of being between two large economic powerhouses, and it was allowed, at the benevolence of both Ivalice and Ordalia, to maintain its sovereignty. This tense but respectful arrangement had existed for nearly a century or so, but this was soon to change, because Ordalia began to get restless and greedy, and they eyed Zalmonia as a potential candidate for annexation. Like the Akasha Empire centuries prior, those in charge of Ordalia believed that the answer to discontent within their own borders was the expansion of those borders, And so, seemingly out of nowhere, Zalmonia soon found itself the target of an Ordalian invasion. The Zalmonia Guard was no match for the might of their aggressors, and the small territory was occupied with relative ease. Though the people of Zalmonia pleaded with the Kingdom of Ivalice for support, their voices fell on deaf ears. Ivalice would not come to Zalmonia's aid, at least not officially. After all, there were important political alliances in place. Behind the scenes, however, Ivalice secretly ordered that arms and intelligence be provided to the Zalmonian resistance, as they were fearful that if Zalmonia was successfully assimilated, that Ordalia may shift their gaze, and the last thing Ivalice wanted was a full-scale conflict with Ordalia. Sadly for the people of Zalmonia, this aid was just not enough, and for nearly a century they suffered under the persistent thumb of Ordalia, biding their time for when they might assert their independence once again. It meant Ivalice effectively left Zalmonia to its fate, but they were not able to maintain their distance forever, as fate had other plans. Chapter 5: The 50 Years' War. The king of Ordalia at the time was Divan III. After ascending to the throne, his role had been made simple: ensure both the continued occupation of Zalmonia and the continued prosperity of Ordalia. But when Divan III died without warning, the court realised no successor had been named, and this caused a crisis. You see, in Ordalia, instead of using hereditary-based succession, they used an elective-based succession, and this meant the incumbent ruler was required to name a specific individual who was to succeed them. As this had not happened, it therefore opened the door for would-be successors to stake a claim. In Ordalia, a claim to the throne was made by Viroy VI, who was a cousin of Divan III, and this choice was seemingly backed by the rest of the Ordalian nobles. But an issue arose. The then king of Ivalice, Dinamda Akasha II, was Divan III's uncle, and he believed his claim to the Ordalian throne was therefore greater than that of Viroy VI, as his sibling had been married into the Ordalian family, and he was therefore a blood relative of the now late king. Sensing an opportunity for expansion, Dinamda II therefore declared himself the rightful heir to Ordalia, and as he had no backing within Ordalia itself, he deigned to take that title by force, having believed that as Ordalia had no specific ruler, they would be unable or unwilling to defend themselves. This in turn kicked off a series of events that dragged the Kingdom of Ivalice, Zalmonia, and the Kingdom of Ordalia into a conflict that ended up having a lasting impact on the entire region. With what they believed to be a legitimate casus belli in place, the Kingdom of Ivalice therefore issued a formal declaration of war. And after consulting with his generals, Dinamda II established the First Order of Business, retaking and liberating Zalmonia from Ordalia. But this was not done as a simply altruistic act. Dinamda II knew that Zalmonia, if freed, would feel indebted, and this meant they would be very likely to allow Ivalice to use their land as a forward staging ground for any further military incursions. But Zalmonia could also be used as a buffer for any Ordalian counterattacks. Regardless of the motivations, the Ivalician army moved swiftly, catching Ordalia by surprise. They took the territory with minimal effort and righted a nearly century-long wrong. This added a good amount of early momentum to their campaign, and this was crucial, as their next step was to push on to their main goal, capturing the Ordalian capital itself, Ajora. Taking a foreign capital and claiming the throne was no easy task though. But Dinamda II was confident in his army's abilities, as they had invested well in their military over the past century due to the instability in the region. Made up of 3 different elite orders of knights, the Ivalician forces were headed by the best warriors the kingdom had to offer. Leading the Order of the Northern Sky was Barbarnath Beowulf, a charismatic and well-liked man whose sense of duty was second only to his swordsmanship. Under his command, he assembled his own elite soldiers. But one of the crucial elements here was that Barbarnath was willing to give any man a chance, irrespective of their social standing and background, if they were good enough with a sword. and amongst the recruits were two individuals called Gustav Margrave and Vigraf Folles, who were eager to grasp the opportunity that had been given to them and prove themselves to their commander on the battlefield. At the head of the Order of the Southern Sky was Sidolphus Orlando, known to his allies and enemies alike as the Thunder God. Like Barbonath, Sidolphus was motivated by a strong sense of duty, and his loyalty seemingly knew no bounds. Finally, there was the Order of the Eastern Sky. This was led in part by Gothard Gafgarian, a pragmatic and exacting individual. Strong-willed and very competent in battle, Gafgarian's units were well known for their brutal fighting style, and the mere mention of the Eastern Sky was often enough to send most enemies running for the hills. These three orders were then overseen and sometimes joined on the battlefield by nobles from House Goltana and House Larg, with Droxmal Goltana, in particular, striking up a strong relationship with Sidolphus due to their shared success. At first, the three orders made great inroads towards their goal of capturing the Ordalian capital, and it seemed as though nothing could stop their progression. The Ordalian army was still not fully mobilized, and their command structure was weak. Losing ground day after day then compounded their issues, and while their morale was at an all-time low, morale amongst the Evilesian troops was at an all-time high. But it was just when things were going well for Ivalice that everything began to fall apart. As strong inroads were being made and the march to Viera had commenced, Dinamda II fell gravely ill. Though the best healers were sent for, and the king tried his best to continue to be the guiding light for his armies, he ultimately succumbed to illness. He perished before ever seeing the walls of the city he had fought so hard to take, and the throne he had tried so hard to claim. Dinamda II's death sent ripples through the Evilesian army's ranks, and their previously high morale was left shattered, not least because his son, Dinamda III, had already perished before his father, and this meant succession was not going to be smooth. The commanders of the orders tried their best to rally their men, but they now had no clear objective. This entire war had been initiated on the basis of Dinamda II's claims to the Ordalian throne, but that claim no longer existed. With Dinamda II now dead, the succession issues plaguing Ordalia had been resolved. As such, Viroy VI was appointed as the true ruler with much haste. But even though his nemesis was now out of the picture, Viroy's first decree was one of revenge. Now unified, Ordalia capitalized on the confusion amongst the Evilesian forces, and they launched a string of counterattacks designed to take back the territory they had lost. Each offensive proved more successful than the last, and subsequent incursions pushed the Sky Orders all the way back to the Zalmonian buffer zone. Everything seemed dire. Ivalice was still without a monarch, and its forces were being routed. To make matters worse, the only way the Orders could ensure a successful withdrawal without sacrificing too many troops was to instead sacrifice their buffer zone. And so they strategically withdrew, retreating behind the safety of their own well-defended borders and abandoning Zalmonia. With both sides now back where they started, a stalemate was reached. But hostilities did not cease. Ordalia, and more specifically Viroy VI, they wanted blood. And as he prepared for a full-scale invasion of Ivalice, he called on some old alliances for support. To the north of Ivalice was another regional power called Romandia. They had been cordial with Ivalice and had been happy to watch from afar as the two powers duked it out. However, with the crowning of Viroy VI atop the Ordalian throne, things changed. You see, the king of Romandia was a close relative of Viroy, and due to this familial bond, he was eager to lend his relative a hand in war, expecting there to be strong rewards should they succeed with the invasion. Together, they made plans to invade Ivalice on two fronts, but Ivalice was not about to lie down and surrender. The tactical withdrawal from Zalmonia had bought the military time, and it had saved the lives of countless soldiers who were now going to be crucial in ensuring Ivalice could defend itself. The issues around succession had also been solved, at least on the surface. It had taken some time to verify, as Dinamda II had fathered numerous children, but owing to the right of succession, even though Dinamda III had died before his father, the title and inheritance was passed to his son, Dinamda IV, instead of any of his siblings. And this did not go over well. for they each believed the right of succession was a sham and that their own claims to the throne had been ignored. Regardless, with the invasion looming, now was not the time for internal squabbles. Dinamda IV was named king, and he alone was given the difficult task of attempting to restore vision and purpose to the Evilesian army and its people. With a central figure now their focus, the armed forces rallied behind their new king. They offered a spirited defence against their Romandian and Ordalian invaders, employing a variety of tactics to succeed. To the east, this meant the Orders were still butting heads with Ordalia. But to the north, the mantle of pushing back the Romandian aggressors fell to Grand Duke Gareth Barrington, head of the noble House Barrington. This house was infamous throughout Ivalice, in part due to the elite assassination squad Barrington had under his command. Known as the Kamja, they were trained in the darkest of arts and well versed in clandestine operations. They revelled in their task of sowing disarray and terror amongst the Romandian forces. It meant any real momentum Romandia had gained was therefore dashed, and it wasn't long before Barrington's divisions were able to drive back their foes, eventually pushing them out of Evilesian territory altogether. Romandia tried to stay in the fight to support their allies, but 3 years into the conflict they were forced to withdraw after an outbreak of the Black Death threatened their own population. The citizens of Romandia were just no longer willing to tolerate their involvement in supporting the monarch's relatives when so many of their own people were dying at home. Thus, the Romandian front ended with no lands changing hands, and Romandia retreated to lick their wounds and tend to their sickly and suffering population. This was a significant victory for Ivalice, but it didn't feel as such. Despite Barrington's efforts, there had still been heavy losses and hardship amongst the general populace, and as a result, poverty and sickness started to become commonplace. With Romandia taken out of the war and the northern front now secure, Dinamda IV was able to turn his full attention towards Ordalia. Due to their strong defensive line and the competency of the Orders, the stalemate between Ordalia and Ivalice had persisted throughout the years of the northern front. Ordalia had been unable to take advantage of the Romandian distraction, but the troops themselves weren't too bothered. They had been more than happy to reclaim the lands they'd lost, and even resubjugate Zelmonia. They understood that the invasion of Ivalice had been fueled by emotion as opposed to logic, and the Ordalian army was therefore quite happy to accept the new status quo. Given their position of strength, in their minds at least, there was just one job remaining, ensuring Ivalice stayed in their lane and didn't get any stupid ideas. But from an Ivalician perspective, Ordalia was still the aggressors. Things had not returned to the way they were before Dinamda II had freed Zelmonia and invaded Ordalia. Trade routes were being blocked, and the people of Ivalice were effectively being suffocated. This meant they only had two real options. One, try to outlast a blockade and sue for peace, something that was never going to end with favourable terms for Ivalice. Or two, try to break out from the Ordalian stranglehold and put fate back in their own hands. Dinamda IV believed the second option was a much easier sell to the people, and so he pitched the idea of a renewed war effort to his generals, as a way of uniting and distracting the people while also freeing them from their prison. After examining all of the available options, the course of action taken by Dinamda IV was the very same that his predecessor, Dinamda II, had taken when he began his own ill-fated campaign. They needed to retake Zelmonia. Discreetly amassing forces along the border, the Ivalician army, led by the three orders, began a surprise attack. For a moment, it seemed that, like before, Ivalice's army could not be stopped, and Ordalian forces were pushed out of Zelmonia and placed on the back foot. But this time, the cost of the Ivalician army was much greater. Unlike before, their numbers were thinner from the start, their supplies were much lower, and the people were just tired from years upon years of conflict and rationing. With the war between the two powers now fully reignited, Ordalia did their best to hold ground and fight back. But they too had spent a great deal of resources on the war, and their troops were equally fatigued. Thus, the two sides clashed back and forth, the victories becoming ever smaller, the losses ever greater. Neither side with the morale to continue, but both sides too proud to give up and surrender. In the end, the fighting just became too much for either nation. Desertion started to become commonplace, and the average rank-and-file soldier wasn't sure that there was much point to this ongoing conflict other than pride. Sensing that another dip of morale could lead to a complete collapse in their own forces, both Ivalice and Ordalia agreed to a temporary halt in hostilities, so that they could separately try and rebuild their wounded countries and their armies. The ceasefire that followed lasted a good few decades. It meant many of the key players from the earlier stages of the war, such as Barbonath Beowulf, Sidolphus Orlando and Gothar Gafgarion, were now getting much older. They were having families of their own and forming their own ideas on how the conflict had shaped Ivalice. Dinamda IV took a similar approach, enjoying this time of peace. But the nature of his enjoyment was to have long-lasting consequences. After getting married, Dinamda IV had one legitimate child, Ondoria, who was the rightful heir to the throne. However, he was also known to enjoy the company of women other than the queen, and the result of these excursions was the birth of a daughter called Avelia. Lacking the same pure bloodline as Ondoria, Avelia was not considered an important cog in the game of succession. She was merely just another bastard child, the likes of which were commonplace amongst monarchs and other high-ranking officials. But when Dinamda IV passed away suddenly, Ivalice was placed in a tenuous position. The cause of the king's death was unclear, and some even believed that he was assassinated. This speculation was then born from the rise of Louveria Larg. House Larg was formed from descendants of one of Dinamda II's children. They were still perturbed at having missed out on the throne to Dinamda IV, and had been plotting behind the scenes, waiting for the perfect time to reclaim the throne that they felt was rightfully theirs. Louveria opted to take an indirect route. She knew that trying to become the de facto ruler by force was unlikely, so she opted to take a shortcut, ensuring that even if she wasn't able to become the monarch herself, then at least her children could be. Thus, Louveria seduced her second cousin, Ondoria, who was heir to the throne. Being such a weak-willed individual, Ondoria was ever so easy to manipulate. And after an initial courting period, marriage soon followed. And this opened the door for Louveria to enact the next part of her plan, the ascension of Ondoria by removing Dinamda IV from the equation. Following the suspicious death of Dinamda IV, there were no squabbles around succession this time. Ondoria was the true heir, and he was crowned with haste as King Ondori III. But what happened next ruffled many feathers amongst the other noble households. Now that her plan had succeeded, Louveria started to show her true colours. It became very clear that it was Louveria who was making decisions around matters of state, not Ondoria, and she didn't even try to hide this fact. Perturbed, some started to speak out against Louveria, and one such individual was Ondoria's own mother, the former Queen of Ivalice. She too mysteriously died soon after voicing strong criticisms of Louveria, and this served as a strong warning to those who might speak out of line. Around the same time as King Ondori III's coronation, the longtime Ordalian ruler, Voroy VI, also passed away from old age. His whole rule had been one spent in war with Ivalice, with nothing to show for it, except the loss of Zalmonia. Voroy's successor was an ambitious man named Lennart. Watching from the sidelines as Voroy whittled away, Lennart had become frustrated with what he perceived to be a lack of ambition and weak leadership. The ceasefire designed to help each nation recover, he felt had lasted too long, and Ordalia was still worse off than when the original conflict had begun. Thus, Lennart sought to see his homeland restored to its former glory, and this meant reclaiming Zalmonia. Lennart immediately ordered that the ceasefire that had stood for decades be broken, and the Ordalian army, with Lennart at the head, proceeded to retake Zalmonia from Ivalice as they were caught by complete surprise. But Lennart did not want to stop there. Ordalian forces pushed further into Ivalice territory than they had ever managed during Voroy's reign, making their way deep into Zeltenia. Here, they broke through the meagre defences that had been mustered and lay siege to the formidable Zeltenia castle. King Ondori III, on the advice of his most trusted advisors and commanders, was convinced to abandon Zeltenia castle and the Ivalician position in Zeltenia in order to regroup for a potential counterattack. It was a notable concession, and it highlighted just how complacent Ivalice had become during the long ceasefire and under the placid rule of Ondoria and his wife Luveria. Ivalice was down, but not out, however. The orders still existed, and the leaders of old rallied their troops. They combined their forces with the personal armies of House Larg, who were now helmed by Bestroled Larg, the brother of Queen Luveria, and House Goltana, still chaired by Druxmold, and they collectively launched a vicious counterattack on Zeltenia. The massacre that ensued saw Odalia pushed all the way back to Zalmonia. The noble houses gained prestige in their victory, but it came at a massive cost. Many soldiers were lost in the counteroffensive, and there was a sense that if Odalia retaliated, they may not have the strength to resist any further. Realizing this, Luveria convinced Ondoria to sue for peace. After all, her goal was to have her lineage sit on the Ivalician throne, and if Lennart conquered Ivalice, there would be no throne left for them to sit on. Lennart accepted the proposal, but as he knew that Ivalice were negotiating from a position of weakness, he ensured the peace agreement was highly favourable to him and his plans for Odalia. The terms were therefore as such. All hostilities between the two nations were to stop immediately. Ivalice, as way of apology, was to owe astronomical reparations to Odalia, and Ivalice would relinquish all legal claims to the territory of Zalmonia. Ondoria was quick to agree to the terms, and thus the 50 Years' War ended, but it merely set the stage for an even bigger conflict. Chapter 6: The Prelude to a New War. By the end of the 50 Years' War, specific houses had seen their standing either improved within the eyes of the aristocracy or diminished. House Orlando, for example, still had the great powerful Cid at its head, and he retained his position as the head of the Order of the Southern Sky. Gothard Gafgarian, for his part in the war, suffered a very different fate though. The nobles deemed his methods too extreme and too barbaric, even by the bloody standards set by the 50 Years' War. He was discharged from his post, and the entire unit he oversaw was disbanded. And then there was Barbonath Beowulf. Of the various orders, the Order of the Northern Sky was by far the most successful. This earned Barbonath platitudes, respect, and perhaps most importantly, status. It meant that of all the great military houses involved in the 50 Years' War, none ended up being as influential as that of House Beowulf. Prior to the war, Beowulfs were already seen as a righteous extension of the Ivalician nobility. Barbonath was just the latest in a long lineage that dated back to the age of Saint Ajora. Throughout the 50 Years' War, he had proved himself every bit as capable as his ancestors, serving as a beacon of justice that struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. Where others failed, Barbonath and his troops succeeded, and his reputation only grew as the war continued. One of the keys to his success was the faith he placed in his troops, irrespective of their backgrounds. Barbonath had, in the minds of some other nobles, become sympathetic to the plight of the common people. He saw the clear divide between the classes and how the nobility were always quite keen to sit in their ivory towers while the less fortunate were expected to toil away and face the realities of life head-on. The Order of the Northern Sky still had divisions as dictated by protocol, but they were made less strict. Barbonath treated his soldiers as people, not as expendable assets, and this was shown by his willingness to even promote those from low-born status into prominent leadership positions. Viglar Foles, for example, was made captain of a peasant volunteer unit known as the Dead Men, and he fought alongside many other soldiers, such as Gustav Margrave. Barbonath's faith in his soldiers was then reciprocated, and this mutual trust meant they took on missions that no others would. It was why so many were willing to fight and overcome insurmountable odds if he was the one giving the command. Barbonath then carried these same values into his personal life. Prior to the outbreak of the war, Barbonath was married to a noble woman. She died sometime during the course of the war though, but not before giving birth to 2 sons, Dystarg and Zalbarg. This dynamic pair were quickly brought up in the ways of the Order of the Northern Sky, and like their father before them, they joined the distinguished ranks of the company once they were of age. But then, Barbonath made a mistake, or at least that's how some viewed it. During the ceasefire, he had a lasting relationship with a woman who did not have highborn status. That woman, who was from the Lugria family, then bore 2 more children named Ramza and Alma. Many of Barbonath's peers would have cast Ramza and Alma aside for fear of judgment and potential scandal. To have sired and acknowledged children born from a commoner was a serious social faux pas and could have severe repercussions. But Barbonath chose a different path. Despite their lesser status, he afforded them the same familial benefits as Dystag and Zelbarg. But as Ramza was too young to fight in the 50 Years' War alongside his brothers, he was entered into the academy. Ramza was not alone in taking this route, however. Due to Barbonath's kind heart, he had also taken in 2 orphaned children whose common parents were claimed by the Black Death during the 50 Years' War. They were called Delita and Tietra, and although they were not given quite the same treatment as Ramza and Alma, they still lived much grander life than the streets would have ever afforded them. This was how the 4 siblings came close, and the bonds between Ramza and Delita grew as they went through the academy together. Throughout this time, very few outside of House Beowulf knew the whole truth about the family, but as the 50 Years' War concluded and Dystag and Zalbarg brought further accolades, their father began to falter, and his altruistic efforts began to have quite significant consequences. Barbonath was too old to see that times were changing. Everyone who was involved in the 50 Years' War was affected in some way or another, but how they felt the effects differed based on side and standing. After 5 decades of combat and territorial disputes, and countless soldiers and civilian lives being lost, no real gains had been made. King Lennart, however, was quite pleased with himself. Ivalice were going to pay for the recovery of the Ordalian nation, and Zarmonia was now their undisputed territory. Ondoria and Luveria were also quite satisfied. The Ivalician throne was intact, and no territory had been lost. But even though the nobles on both sides were quick to pat themselves on the back, their citizens were not anywhere near as enthused. The people of Zarmonia were left stuck under Ordalian rule with no chance of any kind of reprieve. There was also nothing to show for the countless lives that had been lost, and the people of both Ivalice and Ordalia started to become disillusioned and disenchanted with their rulers. They came to realise that the nobles of the ruling class and the great houses had played with their lives. They were merely pawns in a much bigger game that they had been barred from participating in, save from as soldiers, and even then they knew they were nothing more than cannon fodder. In addition, while the nobles continued to act and operate as if nothing had really happened, the common folk were the ones who saw the harshest effects of the war, those of poverty and disease. This resentment was strongest, however, amongst the many veterans who returned from the war. There were no victory parades once the peace treaty was signed, just the promise of returning to a life of unemployment, destitution, and resentment. Families had been uprooted or destroyed, and livelihoods had been lost. In Ivalice, this was felt most harshly, and the overriding sentiment was that Ondoria had screwed over the general populace by signing a horrible deal, a deal that protected everything they, the nobles, were and had, while condemning everyone else. Those who had been willing to give their lives for Ivalice grew jaded as a result. Their only choice to make ends meet was to either take up manual trades and hope for work, or join bandit or mercenary groups who hoped to take back what they felt they were owed by Ivalice's better off. Many of these groups were small and unorganised, but one group, who called themselves the Corpse Brigade, were much more of a threat. They were largely composed of the commoner remnants of the Order of the Northern Sky who had been cast aside following the conclusion of the war, specifically those who were part of the Dead Men. With no active war, there was no longer funds or requirement for the orders to host such individuals. They were cast aside, and Vigraf used this to rally like-minded people to their cause. Former Ivalician soldiers who had come back from the 50 Years' War destitute and no longer wanting to show fealty to the ruling class. Their ambitions were simple: seek revenge on anyone who had more than them, up to and including the nobility themselves, and tear down the established systems to build a new Ivalice. Barbanath was pained by this development, but there was nothing he could do. His power was too little and his health was failing. There were also much wider plans afoot, as in this time of strife, numerous individuals had eyes on the Ivalician throne. House Larg were making their moves and were being rather unsubtle about it. Luveria had reinserted the Larg name back into the line of succession, and the two sons she had now birthed with Andoria were destined to see the Akasha and Larg households reunited under one banner. House Goltana and the other nobles were less than impressed by this development, but they were unable to be anything more than observers. As such, Druxmold focused on shoring up their position and establishing a base, so that if House Larg were to make any kind of offensive move, they might have the military strength to defend themselves and potentially even become independent. The consolidation of the Order of the Southern Sky under their banner was a significant power play in this regard. Unbeknownst to House Goltana, however, they were soon to gain an ally in their quest to destabilise the throne and House Larg. They just didn't know it. Throughout the 50 Years' War, the Church of Glabados had been subtly accruing power. As the war became more dire from the perspective of Ivalice's success or failure, they had offered their services, and Alphonse Delacroix, who served as the commander of the Knights Templar, managed coordination between the Ivalician military and the ecclesiastical authorities. Many saw the church as a bastion of hope due to their compassion and strength, but its leaders had started to lean into the darker sides of humanity, and its most senior militaristic figures were gradually being influenced by a now active Lucavi contingent. Alphonse Delacroix, who had risen to the rank of cardinal, was one such influenced individual, something that likely happened in or around the conclusion of the 50 Years' War. But he was joined by Folmar of Tengil, who took over from Delacroix as commander of the Knights Templar. During this time, Marcel Funebris served as the high priest and current leader of the Church of Glabados. Funebris was a smart man, but he was also ambitious and easily blinded by greed. He had been aware of the Orosite for some time, and the Lucavi subtly fed him just the right amount of information through their agents. So he sought to use the Orosite for his own gain, but only if the right situation were to present itself. With Audelia now out of the equation, Funebris sought to pit the two big Ivalician houses against each other, before swooping in to serve as mediator and then assume control. Thus did Funebris seek to pit Druxmold Goltana, otherwise known as the Black Lion, against Bestrald Larg, otherwise known as the White Lion. There was just one missing piece of the puzzle. Funebris himself had no claim to the throne, and for the two houses to fall foul of the ruse, he therefore needed a proxy that could act in his stead and offer a high degree of credibility. It meant the church needed someone they could mould and manipulate, someone who was part of the nobility and had a loose claim on the throne, but was also an outcast. After searching, they stumbled upon Ovelia, the bastard child of Denamda III. Ovelia at the time was still only a toddler, and had largely been shunned by her family. This had only been exacerbated following the crowning of Andoria, as Luveria had little time or care for dealing with a child that was of no real consequence. It just so happened then that around this time, it's believed that the real Princess Ovelia was assassinated by noble council members and replaced by a lookalike. They had hoped to indoctrinate her and use her to rule as a proxy, revealing the truth if she ever got too far above her station. But they were not the only ones who sought to use Ovelia. Once the church became aware of the assassination, they decided to enact their own variant of the same plot. At the request of the church, this meant Ovelia was placed in their care so they could indoctrinate her in their ways. She was to become the perfect sleeper agent ready to be activated when the time was right. Not long after, Luveria's two sons, that she hoped would bridge the gap between the Larg and Akashan bloodlines, were also assassinated. It's never clear who was responsible for this heinous act, as both the church and allies of House Goltana were the beneficiaries, but it meant that despite all of Luveria's planning, she was now looking at a worst-case scenario. With no heir, Succession was uncertain, and her plan of having House Larg become the new ruling family of Ivalice was doomed to fail. To try and negate this, and diminish House Goltana's preemptive claim, it was suggested that Ondoria adopt his own half-sister. By doing so, even though Avelia was not of pure cash and blood, and she was not a Larg, it did at least mean the right of succession would pass to her, as alongside being Ondoria's half-sister, she was now his daughter. And this would weaken any claim House Goltana may have had. Louveria, although tolerant of this arrangement, was unhappy about its long-term prospects. Everything she had worked so hard for was unravelling before her very eyes, and it was the Akashan bloodline that was to benefit from all of her sacrifices, not the Larg bloodline. By this point, Ondoria, who was already a weak individual to begin with, started to suffer from ill health. This then exacerbated Louveria's problems, and it was therefore seen as some kind of miracle when Louveria announced that she was pregnant and subsequently gave birth to just what she needed, a son named Orinus. There were those who questioned the boy's lineage due to his fortuitous arrival, but those questions never gained too much momentum, and Avelia, for her part, was just cast aside again. This time, however, she found herself under the care of House Goltana, given away as a show of faith between the two great houses. Druxmold then, in turn, handed her back over to the church. It was during this time that Avelia became acquainted with Alma Beolve, and she continued to learn the church's ways. With the birth of Orinus, it seemed as though House Larg were back in a very strong position, and House Goltana felt the same. The Largs held all the cards. Goltana's alignment with the Order of the Southern Sky was therefore crucial, but House Larg were concerned about this arrangement too, as they had no similar arrangement of their own. And as the Order of the Eastern Sky had been disbanded, the only logical course remaining to them was to try and ally themselves with the Order of the Northern Sky. But Barbonath Beolve resisted such an advance, and this did not amuse House Larg. They had attempted to convince Barbonath as to the merits of the alliance, but as they continued to fall on deaf ears, Bestrald Larg decided to approach the family's eldest son, Dystarg, for they had become acquaintances during the latter years of the 50 Years' War. It's unclear whether Dystarg then acted on his own or colluded with Bestrald, but a plan was concocted to remove Barbonath from the equation. Dystarg had started to dabble in the ways of poisoncraft and had become aware of a unique type of poisonous mushroom called moss fungus. Believing it to be untraceable, Dystarg then started using moss fungus on his father. Ailed by a mysterious illness, doctors and healers were left stumped. With their father's health failing, it was assumed that Dystarg would then take over as the head of the house and commander of the Order of the Northern Sky, as he was the older sibling. But he opted to cede his position to his younger brother Zalbarg, instead taking up a new position of advisor to the Larg family. This then saw the Order of the Northern Sky allied with House Larg, as due to his position, Dystarg effectively served as Zalbarg's superior. Bestrald was very happy with this arrangement. He now had a suitable military might supporting his family that was on par, if not superior, to that of House Goltana. In addition to this, he was also confident that he had leverage over Dystarg due to the knowledge of how Barbonath had to be removed. But he was unaware that Dystarg had ambitions beyond his station. Even with the Beolve patriarch on his deathbed, as the family's elder sons were now installed as the head of the Order of the Northern Sky and advisor to the Duke of Galleon, House Beolve found itself in a strong position. But the kindness of Barbonath's heart had also left the house open to scandal, and as Ivalice then turned its gaze inwards following the conclusion of the 50 Years' War, the various power players of the great houses, churches and common people began to make their tentative first steps into a new era. Though Barbonath had tried his best to instill his values and sense of honour and duty into his children, they would all soon be tested, and he wouldn't be around to watch how things played out, and how the kingdom of Ivalice and his family were to be torn apart. After the birth of Prince Orinus, the health of King Ondori III started to deteriorate rapidly. Should the worst happen, and the king perish, Queen Louveria was then quick to put forward that Prince Orinus should be named as the next king of Ivalice. Due to his age though, she was to act as Queen Mother, with betrothed Larg there to step in and serve as regent to the boy until such a time that he may be old enough to rule by himself. This proposal had a severe bias and firmly placed House Larg as the rulers of Ivalice. Luveria had outfoxed the nobles yet again. But the uncertainty around Oronus' birth did at least provide them with an opportunity. The rival nobles therefore proposed an alternative plan. Given Ovelia's supposed bloodline, she was also a very strong candidate to succeed on Doria. They put their weight behind Ovelia taking the throne, not Oronus, and with Droxmal Gortana serving as regent due to Ovelia also not being old enough. Thus, two rival factions were created in the fight for succession, those in favour of House Larg and the White Lion, and those in favour of House Gortana and the Black Lion, and the Church were well poised to take advantage. It was around this time that Ramza and Delita were undergoing their military training as Knights Apprentices at Garland Academy. This was situated in Ivalician territory in Gallione under the watchful eye of Duke Larg. The Academy, known by its formal title of the Royal Academy for the Magical Arts, had produced numerous powerful mages and warriors throughout the years, and many had fought on the Ivalician side of the 50 Years' War. Here, alongside other fellow Knights Apprentices, Ramza and Delita trained day and night to hone their skills, and even though the war was now over, they hoped to soon join the ranks of the Order of the Northern Sky as Dystar and Zalbarg had done before them. As it turned out, that request was to come sooner than anyone anticipated. Even though there was no longer an external conflict to contend with, the Order of the Northern Sky were deployed to deal with an internal one, and it was not to stand in opposition to House Gortana and the Order of the Southern Sky. Instead, it was something that the nobles who lived in the Gallian region perceived to be something of a nuisance. Roving bands and the outlaw group known as the Corpse Brigade had started to flourish after the conclusion of the war, and the problems seemed to only be growing day by day. This was compounded by the leaders of the Corpse Brigade being two former members of the Order of the Northern Sky. Although neither were from noble bloodlines, both Vigraf and Gustav were battle-hardened veterans who had served under Barbonath Beowulf. Similar uprisings were happening all across Ivalice, but the one in Gallione was by far the most organised. Bestrold, for his part, seemed acutely aware that the Corpse Brigade needed to be dealt with before any further ambitions could be entertained, and he also knew not to take them lightly. His scouts had reported that many of its senior figures were indeed veterans from the 50 Years' War who had served under Barbonath Beowulf. They were therefore skilled and organised, and perhaps most importantly, they were well versed in the operations and tactics of the Order. But they were still peasants, and so Bestrold sought to destabilise them behind the scenes by giving them what they wanted: money. On the surface, this meant Bestrold commissioned a considerable force to deal with the threat to appease the other nobles. At its helm was his own royal guard, who were rallied from Airgros Castle. Due to Dystar now serving as the advisor to House Larg, he then lent on his brother for support. But as the war was still freshly concluded, Zalbarg struggled to muster the appropriate resources. Many of the Order had either perished in the war itself, or just no longer had the fight left in them. Others had been made redundant due to the lack of funding, or chosen to leave as they had sworn to serve Barbonath, not his progeny. Due to this scenario, while the Larg Royal Guard were to lead the assault, the Order of the Northern Sky were to be used to hunt down the various dens of the Corpse Brigade and make examples of them to the other bandit gangs. But while they went about this gruesome joint effort, Airgros Castle, the hub of House Larg, was left undermanned. As a result, Zalbarg decided to recruit graduates from the Royal Academy, and they were to be posted at Airgros Castle as a failsafe, supporting the campaign from the rear and bolstering the defence of key strategic locations. To this end, both Ramza and Delita were dispatched amongst the contingent, leaving Gariland and making their way west towards Airgros Castle by way of the Mandalia Plain. They were never expected to see any real combat. But the troop of graduates soon had their first encounter with their new enemy, or at least that's how things seemed. For alongside commissioning a military force to deal with the Corpse Brigade, Dystag, at the behest of Bestrald, had secretly made contact with Gustav and struck a deal. It was well known that the Marquis Elmdor, the liege lord of Limbury, was venturing to the Garreland region to meet with Bestrald Larg. Elmdor was presumably either seeking counsel from a fellow regional leader about how to deal with the peasant uprisings, or to try and sober relations between the two powerful houses. After all, it was common knowledge that during the 50 Years' War, Elmdor had served under Druxmal Goltana, and that they had an informal alliance on Ivalice's eastern flank. Larg's plan was therefore simple. If Elmdor were to be abducted en route to Gallione, his men could then miraculously mount a valiant rescue, and Elmdor would be indebted to them and perhaps even consider switching that allegiance. And if the Marquis happened to die in the crossfire, then he'd simply have one less rival noble to worry about. With the plan hatched, Dystag paid Gustav to abduct Elmdor as a way of killing two more birds with one stone. Gustav's defection would weaken the Corpse Brigade, and by implicating them, it would give House Larg strong validation for coming down even harder on the military group without affecting the wider sentiment of them stamping out a peasant uprising. Gustav agreed to the proposal, but he also sought to alter the deal behind Dystag and Bestrald's back. Instead of abducting Elmdor outside the Gallione region as agreed, he would do the exact opposite. For he knew that doing so would then apply pressure on the Larg household. After all, if the kidnapping happened in their territory, he knew they would be pressured to bring about a swift resolution. Gustav then planned to take advantage of this desperation by demanding a ransom. He knew this was playing with fire, as he'd be extorting additional money from a man who had already paid him, but Gustav felt no remorse whatsoever. This was money he felt the nobles owed, and once they paid, he planned to disappear. Ramza and Delita arrived at the scene of Elmdor's abduction. The noble was long gone, and the last remaining survivors of Elmdor's retinue were being executed so that nobody could talk. One survivor, a young man of nobility named Arguth, pleaded for assistance in fending off his assailants, and bound by duty, Ramza and Delita obliged. The skirmish was brief. As their aggressors' senior figures had already left the scene, those that remained were opportunistic and less disciplined. They were more akin to rogues and vagabonds than skilled fighters, and were dispatched with ease by the royal graduates. Arguth then pleaded with Ramza and Delita for further assistance in chasing down the outlaws who took the Marquis. But this request was denied. Ramza deduced that the Marquis would not have been kept alive unless there was a good reason, and he thought it best to continue to Aegros Castle and report what they had learned. Dystag was, of course, already aware of the plot because it wasn't going to plan. Gustav had proven himself to be no longer a useful asset. He was now a dog that was biting the hand that had fed him, and as such, he needed to be put down. This, fortunately, coincided with Bestrald's need to save face, given Gustav's decision to stay the operation within the Gallione region. Dystag therefore instructed Zalbarg and the Order of the Northern Sky to try and retrieve the Marquis and slay Gustav. Arguth pleaded with Dystag to allow him to mount a rescue attempt of his own, but with Gustav already deviating from the agreed upon plan, the last thing Dystag wanted was to deal with some upstart noble who was trying to act well above his station. In response, Dystag therefore offered a cutting rebuke, one that referenced not only Arguth's position as a rank-and-file soldier, but also his lower status. For despite being part of a once noble family, the Thedolfus name had fallen in stock when Arguth's grandfather had turned traitor after being taken prisoner in the 50 Years' War, and the reminder stung. It meant there was nothing Arguth could do except respect Dystag's authority, lest his social standing be further penalised. And so, after being reassigned as a menial guard alongside Ramza and Delita, Arguth put up no further protestation. Their job, as originally intended, was to keep watch at Aegros Castle. But Zalbarg had other plans, and he sought to use his younger brother. Almost as soon as the Order of the Northern Sky had been conscripted to try and deal with the threat posed by the Corpse Brigade, Zalbarg had attempted to conduct reconnaissance of his own. After all, they were led by former members of his own order, and he wanted to better understand their depth and how they operated. Dystarg, however, prohibited him from obtaining any kind of real intelligence about the Corpse Brigade, and this meant Zalbarg only had access to what was drip-fed to him by either his elder brother or Bestrald Larg. And this did not sit well. So he sent out a small selection of spies. Those spies, however, had ceased communication. Zalbarg surmised this was not a coincidence. The spies had either got too close to the Corpse Brigade and been silenced, or worse, perhaps someone was attempting to interfere. Either way, Zalbarg believed the whole ordeal revolving around the Marquis was suspicious. They had demanded a large ransom for the safe return of the Marquis, and this seemed antithetical to what he knew about the Corpse Brigade's wider mission. As critics of the crown and nobility, they were anarchists who sought to tear down the systems of oppression that they were victims of. Therefore, why would they bother to keep the Marquis alive and demand a ransom for his life, if both money and nobility symbolised everything they thought was wrong with the world? It was for this reason that Zalbarg confided in Ramza his feelings about everything that was happening. Zalbarg's confession left Ramza in a quandary. Dystarg, his older and more reputable brother, had commanded him to stay and guard Irgros Castle. But a carrot had been dangled that suggested not everything was as straightforward as it seemed. Thus, Ramza and Delita and Argoth decided to defy Dystarg's orders and investigate where the trail of Zalbarg's spy had gone cold by heading to the merchant city of Dorta. They initially thought they had hit a dead end, but then a jackpot. Stragglers from the Corpse Brigade were spotted, and they were interrogated. Both Ramza and Delita were somewhat disturbed by Argoth's rather brutal interrogation techniques. It was clear that Argoth had a disdain for lowborn citizens, and it was also clear that this was a projection for the way he himself was treated by other nobles. Nonetheless, it was effective, and they learned that the Marquis was being held at the Sanrat Siege out in the Zekless Desert to the north. Upon arriving, the trio used their superior fighting skills to dispatch the Corpse Brigade soldiers who were garrisoned there. But as they ventured deeper into the ruins, they came across the aftermath of a rift between Vigraf and Gustav that had played out just moments before their arrival. Vigraf was disappointed that Gustav had strayed from the vision of the Corpse Brigade, and after realizing his former ally could no longer be trusted, Vigraf felt there was no choice left but to execute Gustav. He could just not afford such amateurish behaviour if they were going to see their goal realised. This show of force highlighted just how desperate and dogmatic the Corpse Brigade were under Vigraf's leadership. They had clear goals, and they were not willing to compromise. As a show of faith, Vigraf then handed over the Marquis in exchange for safe passage away from the Zekless Desert. Argoth was incredulous that a lowborn knave even thought he could make a deal with nobles, but Ramza and Delita agreed with Vigraf's terms. It meant Vigraf escaped, able to continue serving as the commander of the Corpse Brigade, and the Marquis was free. Upon returning to Irgros Castle, Dystarg was angered beyond measure. Even though the situation had been resolved, his younger brother had defied a direct order, and it could have easily ended up another way. Bestrald, however, was less concerned about military statutes. With the Marquis rescued and Gustav slain, the group had cleaned up Dystarg's mess by showing incredible initiative. Their lack of seniority was merely the icing on the cake, something that Bestrald could use to aggrandize the tale. As part of this, Bestrald suggested that the group's talents were wasted on guard duty, implying to Dystarg that they be put into active service immediately. Not only would this serve as useful propaganda, but Bestrald also deduced that they were willing to risk their own lives through false concepts of loyalty, and that could be exploited. Dystarg was perturbed by this judgment, but he was unable to refuse his lord's will. Thus Ramza, Delita and Argoth saw their responsibilities increased. They were made a formal part of the upcoming military operation that was to see the Order of the Northern Sky and the Royal Guard rout the Corpse Brigade's remaining forces. Ramza was to even lead his own dedicated mission, they were to launch a small strike on a known den of the Corpse Brigade. It was here that they had their first encounter with Miluda Foles, sister of Vigraf Foles. The Corpse Brigade, by this point, had been fractured by the military efforts of the Order of the Northern Sky and the more subtle espionage deployed by Bestrald Larg. It had created disparate factions that were now desperate and ready to fight tooth and nail for their lives. Miluda, for her part, attempted to reason with the small band, but while Delita sympathised with their plight, Argoth was antagonised, and it was Argoth's rash response that made the fight unavoidable. Miluda's Corpse Brigade contingent fought well, but ultimately they could not fend off the assault. Her soldiers lay slain, and Miluda begged for death. At this moment, Ramza sought the counsel of Delita, and subsequently, he chose to let Miluda live. Reflecting on their bittersweet victory, Ramza and his party returned to Irgros Castle to learn that it had been assaulted by an arm of the Corpse Brigade led by a man named Gragaroth. Their hope was to assassinate Dystarg, but after failing, they took Delita's sister Teatra as hostage, believing her to be a noble, to ensure their escape. Unfortunately, she was not a noble, and after it seemed as though Dystarg was more concerned with the elimination of the Corpse Brigade than Teatra's safe return, Delita was incensed. To make matters worse, Argoth, who had been carrying a chip on his shoulder ever since Miluda had been spared, further insulted Delita, telling him that his sister's common blood wasn't worth the rescue effort. This was a step too far. Delita struck Argoth with a clean punch to the face before being restrained by Ramza. Their once ally proved to be an ally no longer. However, before departing, Argoth did at least inform Ramza that the Corpse Brigade had made their base at Ezekton Fortress. Ramza accepted the news, but the damage had been done. His party was fractured, and there was no guarantee for the safe return of Teatra. There was just an unfortunate acceptance that he and Delita would need to rely on their own strength if they were to try and bring her back alive. Both Ramza and Delita had always been brothers in arms, and their sisters had also found common ground. But even though they shared some similarities, owing to Ramza and Alma having half noble blood, there was always a sense that, despite being raised within the Beowulf household, Delita and Teatra were not Beowulfs. They had been brought up in the same household and afforded the same opportunities, but their family name was not Beowulf, and this was what defined them, not the strength of their character nor their talents. Argoth's words had made that all too clear, but when they stumbled upon Miluda's beaten and battered company once again while on their way to Ezekton Fortress, Delita saw the other side too. Even though both he and Teatra were commoners and should have been seen as kindred spirits to those in the Corpse Brigade, that did not turn out to be the case. Whether they had the Beowulf family name or not, Miluda saw Delita and Teatra as leeches, and this was when Delita realised the truth. To those like Argoth, he was never going to be considered noble enough due to their common blood. But to those like Miluda, irrespective of their shared common blood, they were considered to be of highborn privilege. Ramza attempted to make all sides see reason, that there was no need to fight, but Miluda was too hateful to listen to the words of a noble, and she sought to die on her feet rather than swinging from the gallows. Thus, Miluda perished, and Ramza and Delita, who had largely lived sheltered lives up until this point, were both awakening to a form of class consciousness, albeit from opposite ends. Word of Miluda's death soon reached her brother Vigraf by way of a scout. As it turned out, Vigraf and Gragaroth's company had not yet made their way to Ezekton Fortress, so in order to buy his soldiers time to escape, Vigraf opted to stay behind to both confront their pursuers and also to have a chance at revenge for his sister's death. This, in turn, allowed Gragaroth to retreat with Teatra to Ezekton Fortress, leaving Vigraf to his own devices, and so did he square off against Ramza and Delita in battle. The pair again attempted to seek reason, but Vigraf delivered cutting words as they parleyed, and this was where the first seeds were planted, as Vigraf accused Dystarg of manufacturing this entire charade. The battle ended with no clear victor, but after Vigraf retreated, Ramza struggled to reconcile what he had heard. There was surely no way his brothers, fellow members of the Beowulf clan, would operate in such a way. But deep down, he knew that Vigolf had no reason to lie. There was no time to dwell, however. Teutra was still in danger. Arriving soon at Ziegden Fortress, they linked up with Zalbarg and the Order of the Northern Sky, who had the fortress surrounded. Gragoroth, now cornered, attempted to use Teutra to turn the tides, threatening to kill her if the Northern Sky Knights did not withdraw. Furthermore, he told Zalbarg that the fortress was packed to the brim with explosives, and that if the Northern Sky still didn't retreat, then he would blow everyone sky high. But both this and the threat of harm to Teutra were no concern to Zalbarg. His only concern was the eradication of the Corpse Brigade, and should they win this skirmish, that objective was closer to being fulfilled. Thus did Zalbarg command an end to the charade. Argoth was only too happy to oblige. His first crossbow bolt was aimed at Teutra, designed to remove any leverage Gragoroth may have. The callous nature of this action stunned the Corpse Brigade commander, leaving him open for Argoth to unleash another shot. Wounded, Gragoroth then managed to crawl inside a nearby doorway for shelter before backup arrived. Zalbarg then took his leave to deal with the remnant forces, who were supposedly led by Vigolf, leaving Argoth behind to deal with Gragoroth and whomever might be inside the shelter. Delita watched as his sister was shot. He was enraged by what had happened, not least because Argoth had shown absolutely no remorse in carrying out Zalbarg's commands. Thus did Delita turn on his former allies, and Ramza felt as though he had no choice but to stick by his longtime friend. Together, they killed all the remaining members of the Order, including Argoth. But it was too late. They rushed to Teutra's side, only to find that she was already dead. And this moment was to have far-reaching consequences, for neither Ramza, Delita, nor Ivalice would ever be the same again. Chapter 7. The Duality of Man. After what he had witnessed at Ziegden Fortress, Ramza was lost. He had just watched a fellow noble, who he had once fought alongside, murder his adopted sister. And in the aftermath, he thought his best friend, and adopted brother, had been blown up in the massive munitions explosion that had engulfed the fortress, Gragoroth's final act of defiance. The way his brothers had acted also felt like a betrayal to everything he had been brought up to believe in. Upon reflection, Ramza no longer wanted to be a Beowulf, nor did he want to consort with so-called nobles. And so, he turned his back on his family and the Order of the Northern Sky, opting to instead become a mercenary who sold his sword to the highest bidder. Delita, on the other hand, who had very much survived the events of Ziegden Fortress, took a very different view. Instead of succumbing to grief or continuing to play the expected role, he vowed to no longer be a victim. Taking inspiration from the likes of Vigolf, Miluda and Gustav, he sought to end the dominance of the nobility and usher in a new order. But to do this, he would have to be cold, callous and uncaring of the fallout, at least in the immediate sense. So while Delita did also turn his back on his former family and the Order of the Northern Sky, instead of becoming a mercenary, it's believed he aligned himself with the Order of the Ebon Eye, a group not dissimilar to the Corpse Brigade who were rising up in the region of Zeltenia. Given his background, it did not take long for Delita to prove his worth, and this then brought him to the attention of the Church of Glabados, who had forged a secret pact with the Ebon Eye. On the surface, this seemed an unlikely alliance, but it worked in well with the wider objectives of the High Confessor, Marcel Funebris, because while the Corpse Brigade had been largely eradicated in the Gallione region, the Ebon Eye could still be used to help destabilise House Goltana and fan the flames of war. They figured this could be accomplished by taking advantage of the general uprising, but also by inserting double agents within the ranks of House Goltana. There was just the issue of how to integrate a commoner into such noble ranks, and this led to a new posting for Delita. Due to his rather unique background, Delita was chosen by the church to infiltrate the house, and this was to be achieved in the most unorthodox but genius of ways. Tasked with countering the Ebon Eye was a man named Baron Grimms, who led the Blackram Knights. As was in the case in Gallione, however, they were struggling to contain the uprising. The church knew it was only a matter of time before Baron Grimm's forces crumbled. They just had to be patient, and once they did, they could then install Duality in their ranks. Once inserted, Duality would then be able to pass valuable information back to the church about the plans House Goltana and indeed the Order of the Southern Sky were hatching. Duality was more than happy with this assignment. Ever since he had heard Vigrav's claims about the Beowulf's involvement in events surrounding the Corpse Brigade, his eyes had been opened to the deceptions of the world. He was now starting to learn more and more about the complex web that enveloped Ivalice, and with access to so much additional information, he could start to craft his own plans. For information was power. At first, Duality had sought to seek revenge against the nobles for the death of his sister, but this quickly grew into something much loftier, a notion of claiming Ivalice for himself and destroying the inequality that existed, and he'd do all of this off the backs of the nobles and the church. The decisions of both Ramza and Duality led to a fateful encounter that took place at the Aubon Monastery, the location of Avelia Akasha. As the health of King Ondori III was worsening by the second, House Goltana and their noble allies felt it may be prudent to move Avelia to a safer location. They just couldn't risk the enemy scuppering their plans. After seeking counsel from the Church of Glabados, it was advised that Avelia be moved to the Aubon Monastery, where she could be taught by Simon Pen Laquiche and guarded by Agrius Oaks, one of the kingdom's finest knights. After a disagreement with the church, Simon had become something of a hermit. He was therefore considered the perfect person to oversee Avelia, as it would draw no attention. And given the seclusion of Aubon, its unassuming position within the church, and the low public importance placed on Simon's work, both parties believed Avelia would be safe in this location. But it was a mere ruse. The church had chosen the location due to its positioning within Ivalice. Aubon was at the southern tip of the Lassalia region, not too far from Gallione. This made it a tantalizing prospect for certain players who might look to use Avelia for their own gain, and one of them was Dystark Beowulf. Becoming advisor to Bestrald Larg had been just one step in Dystark's wider plan. Even though commoners felt lesser than the nobles themselves felt lesser than the royals. Amongst the nobles, few families were as reputable as House Beowulf, but as they were not descendants from Dinamda II, the house had no claim on the throne. Dystark's objective was therefore rather simple: remove all potential obstacles and seize the throne for himself, without anyone being able to question what had happened. You see, should Dystark attempt to leverage the Order of the Northern Sky right now to seize the throne, he would have limited support. It would be akin to a military coup. He therefore wanted to assist with the succession of Orinus to the throne, thus allowing Bestrald Larg to serve as regent. Once his situation had occurred, he then planned to assassinate Luveria and Bestrald, removing House Larg from the equation, before proposing the only sensible option that remained. He would serve as regent and protector, and he would be supported by the strongest military in the land. There was just one problem: Avelia. While she still lived and breathed, the succession of Orinus remained uncertain. Thus, he plans to abduct and then murder Avelia. For this task, Dystark himself commissioned a mercenary band helmed by Gothard Gafgarian, the once famed knight from the Order of the Eastern Sky who had a reputation for brutality. But unbeknownst to Dystark, Gafgarian now had Ramza on his books. Having learnt of Avelia's location, Gafgarian was paid to arrive at the monastery and present orders for Avelia's transfer to a more secure location. To make this seem convincing, the orders were to explain that their position had been compromised and the princess was no longer safe. And as these were to have a false royal decree, duty-bound, Agrius was to have followed them without question. En route, they were then to murder Avelia and make it look like it had been an unfortunate occurrence at the hands of random bandits. The plan was very similar to the one Bestrald Larg concocted to deal with the Marquis Elmdor, but Dystarg had learnt from that particular incident. This time, there were to be no mishaps. But due to how much more complicated and sophisticated the plan ended up becoming, it's believed the Church and the Order of the Ebon Eye managed to catch wind, no doubt when Dystarg was attempting to find the appropriate hired help. As the Church also sought to use Avelia for their own purposes, she was more useful to them alive than dead. Thus, a counterplan was concocted, and Delita was to be at the centre. He was to lead a small group of soldiers to perform their own abduction, and they were to be dressed as if they were from the Order of the Southern Sky. Whereas Dystarg hoped to hire mercenaries, using them as a patsy, so that there could be no ties back to him, the Order of the Northern Sky, or the Largs, the Church hoped to frame Druxmal Goltana. After Gafgarian, Ramza and the rest of the mercenary crew had showed up at Olbon to meet with Agrias, they had barely begun preparing for their immediate departure back to Gallione when they were besieged from all sides by Delita's retinue. Agrias was perplexed by this turn of events. Even though Avelia had been taken in by House Goltana following the birth of Orinus, and Druxmold was supporting her soft claim to the throne along with many other nobles who were against Luvaria and House Larg, Avelia had been moved to Aubonne as a way of House Goltana being able to maintain a neutral stance. Agrias herself was even part of the Lion's Guard, the personal bodyguards of the royal family. It meant the kidnapping of Avelia by the Order of the Southern Sky made no sense. For if they were to take Avelia by force, this was a clear showing of the hand. It implied that House Goltana was ready to make a direct move against Orinus and start a coup. There was little time to dwell on the matter, however. Agrias trusted Gafgarian and his mercenaries to repel the Southern Sky Knights and keep Avelia safe. After all, they had just come to warn them that such an occurrence could take place. But they were so distracted by the heat of the battle that they remained oblivious to what was happening behind the scenes. By the time they realised Avelia was gone, it was too late. She had been kidnapped by Delita, and all they could do was watch as the pair disappeared on a chocobo. As the dust settled, Agrias and Gafgarian attempted to comprehend their own internal failures. She had failed in her duty as bodyguard, and he had failed in his attempt to assassinate his target. Ramza, on the other hand, was merely perplexed as to how and why his old friend was involved. As a result, there was no choice but to set off in pursuit of Delita. But to ensure their efforts were hindered, the Church started to pay brigands to stand in their way. These sellswords merely stalled progress, however, and when they caught up with Delita at Zarkile Falls, they found that he was already dealing with an uncomfortable situation. To ensure there was no failure, Dystarg had created a contingency plan, and this meant sending more knights from the Order of the Northern Sky to roam the surrounding area in case Avelia managed to escape. After intercepting the duo, they first tried to coax the princess into their protection, but Delita was far too clued up to fall for such a simple ruse. Realising their efforts were not going to bear the expected fruits, the knights showed their hand, and so too did Gafgarian. Thus began a complex parley, as Gafgarian and Delita wrestled with the worth of Avelia and who should be implicated for deeds not yet done. Gafgarian was left to rue his admissions, however, as both he and the Northern Sky were routed, before Delita also fled from the scene. This placed Avelia back in the trusted hands of Agrias, but they now had a new ally in the form of Ramza. It was here, however, that they encountered a problem. If the parley was to be believed, then neither House Larg or the Order of the Northern Sky could be trusted, nor could House Goltana or the Order of the Southern Sky. It meant their only chance of respite was to seek refuge with the Church of Glabados. Thus did they make their way for Lionel Castle, whose proprietor was Alphonse Delacroix, the former war hero turned Lucavi puppet. In his new role as Cardinal, Alphonse was given the official task of hunting down and procuring the Orosite by Marcel Funebris, but he was already working towards that objective anyway, as he had been possessed by Cahulain. But this task was not simple. The challenge was that due to the historical value of the Orosite, they had a significant amount of political weight and value. As such, they were often quite difficult to obtain. The Virgo orosite, for example, was being treated as an heirloom by the Akashan Empire. This meant it had a huge amount of value to them, and they were unlikely to just hand it over to the church if they asked nicely. The church therefore had to employ numerous tactics to acquire the orosite. They knew, for example, that when Avelia was transferred to the Aubon monastery, that the Virgo orosite would travel with her, as it was proof of her royal lineage. And the Aubon monastery was a much less secure location than the vault of a well-defended castle. But not every orosite was in the hands of such powerful forces. And after learning that an archaeologist and technologist called Besrudio Bonanza had discovered the Taurus orosite, the cardinal was swift to act. As Besrudio was also based in the region of Lionel, Alphonse sought to hire a partner to procure the stone. After much consideration, he chose the Bayard Trading Company. They were infamous across Ivalice for being involved in all sorts of seedy activities, and their leader, Ludwig, was as ruthless as they came. Besrudio, however, was not stupid. Fearing that this stone may bring trouble, he gave it to his son, Mustadio, and told him to hide it somewhere safe. Mustadio opted to find a suitable location in their hometown, the clockwork city of Galg, but the plan soon started to unravel, at least on the surface. As predicted by Besrudio, the Bayard Trading Company soon ransacked the Bonanza home. Besrudio was captured during the clandestine operation, and his life was threatened should he not give up the location of the stone. Fortunately, he had no idea where it was, but he did reveal that his son, Mustadio, had hidden it somewhere, and that they'd never find it. Given their network, it did not take long for the Bayard Trading Company to track Mustadio down. Fortunately, Mustadio had realised that some extra trickery may be required to get an organisation such as the Bayards off their backs. So, instead of simply hiding the Taurus orosite by itself, he also planned to hide forgeries. This turned out to be a prudent move, as after only one forgery had been placed, he was spotted and surrounded. Had Ramza and Agrias not been situated nearby and come to his aid, Mustadio was sure to have been captured, or worse. After their pursuers had been slain, Mustadio thanked the pair. But having learnt that divulging their ownership of the Taurus orosite could lead to unwanted attention, he kept his cards close to his chest, merely stating that he needed to get to Lionel Castle with haste to speak to the cardinal. The truth was, he had no hope of recovering his father alive without help, and he just prayed the cardinal saw fit to lend aid. With the party already venturing that way, they allowed Mustadio to join their band, and thus did the cardinal get delivered almost everything he had hoped for. On the one hand, Avelia had been delivered to him, just as the leader had promised, and on the other hand, Mustadio had come begging for help, even though the cardinal was the one behind his father's kidnapping in the first place. The only thing missing was the orosite itself. Upon meeting the group, the cardinal was at his deceiving best. Agrias recounted the tale of the attempted kidnapping and murder of Avelia, and he was quick to offer support and protection, even going so far as to promise that he would expose Duke Larg's misdeeds. And then, after hearing of Mustadio's predicament, he offered a company of his finest soldiers to aid in the rescue of Besrudio. What the cardinal chose not to share, however, was that Avelia was now to be his prisoner, a pawn to be used as they stoked fires of war between House Larg and House Goltana, and that the company of soldiers that had been so kindly allocated to securing Besrudio were to betray Mustadio as soon as they confirmed the location of the orosite. Upon arriving in Galg, Mustadio sensed that something was off immediately. There were no signs of any goons from the Bayard Trading Company, and the soldiers promised by the cardinal were not at the planned meeting point. Soon, they found out why. Ludwig had been waiting in the wings, watching Ramza and Mustadio as they explored. He soon ordered them to be surrounded. A bound and beaten Besrudio was then dragged out before Ludwig demanded that the two hand over the orosite. He offered them one last chance to comply before following through on his promise to kill Besrudio. Mustadio, recognizing they had little hope of turning the situation around, complied, and directed Ramza to retrieve a forged stone from a nearby chimney and hand it over to Ludwig. Now in possession of what he believed was the real Taurus orosite, Ludwig was ecstatic, and seeing no more use for Ramza, Mustadio and Busridio, he ordered his soldiers to kill the lot. But not before letting it slip that the true mastermind behind everything was the Cardinal himself. After overcoming Ludwig's trap, Mustadio revealed the truth of the forgery to his father before presenting the real Taurus Orosite. But there was little time to celebrate, as if the Cardinal had lied about wanting to assist Mustadio, then Ramza deduced that Agrias and Avelia were also in grave danger. The only problem was that because of what had happened, safe travel was no longer assured. So instead of venturing back to Lionel Castle on the open road by way of the Fenlands, they opted to travel by sea to the port city of Wagilis, and then venture north by way of the Belias Swale. Wagilis was also the home base of the Bayard Trading Company. The assumption was that as Ludwig was already on his way to Lionel Castle, he would never have suspected movement on the other side of the region, even if he had learnt of their escape. But someone else had been watching their progress from the shadows, Delita. He had found amusement in Ramza's noble actions, not least because he was actually one of the few of his ilk that was acting in accordance of the expected values. But instead of giving praise to Ramza, Delita offered up a warning: divert your path or suffer the consequences. Unlike Ramza, who was acting through nothing more than blind ignorance and what he thought to be morally correct, Delita no longer cared about such things. In the years since they parted, he had gathered as much information as he could, learning about the various power struggles that were at play and what each player sought to achieve. And it was for this very reason that, even if their goals may have been the same, his methods could not have been more opposed. That was what truth did to a man, however, and that truth was already playing out at Lionel Castle. The Cardinal was busy conducting a post-mortem of the events that had transpired at Galg, while also testing out a new informal alliance. It had not taken long to establish that Ludwig was duped. What he believed to be the Taurus Orosite was in fact a complete fake. As a consequence for this failure, the Cardinal assigned the task of acquiring the real Orosite to his new ally. Knowing that Avelia had escaped Dystark's grasp, as, well, the Cardinal had been the one to conspire with Delita to foil Dystark's plot, he reached out and informed them that Avelia was now under his protection. This was then used as a way of further manipulating House Lark. Dystark sent Gafgarian immediately to retrieve her, but when Gafgarian arrived, the Cardinal suggested unfavourable terms, as he never expected to deliver on them. With the Orosite still out of reach and Ludwig having failed, he informed Gafgarian that he would only hand over Avelia once the Orosite had been retrieved. Gafgarian begrudgingly agreed, but Ludwig was incensed by this flagrant disrespect. How dare the task that was previously assigned to him be given to someone else? To the Cardinal, this outburst was just the latest issue. Ludwig had failed him one too many times, and the result was deserving of punishment. He was never seen again. The new plan proposed by the Cardinal was simple. Make Agrias and Ramza believe Avelia was to be executed so as to draw them out. They would then retrieve the Orosite and kill every witness. Despite agreeing to the plan, Gafgarian felt it was reckless, but he had no choice but to execute it as best as he could, because his situation was not too dissimilar to Ludwig's. He had already failed twice and needed to make up for his mistakes, and cover Dystark's tracks. While still held captive, Agrias was fed just enough information to make her believe the threat was real, before being lulled into thinking she had escaped from prison of her own accord. They then hoped that Agrias would seek help from Ramza, which she did, and that after reuniting, they would rush to Golgolada Gallows, the very same site where Saint Ajora was executed centuries prior, only to find out they had been duped. The Cardinal, pleased with how he was pulling the strings, sat and waited at Lionel Castle, enjoying time with Folmar of Tengil, the leader of the Templar Knights, who had inherited the role from Alphonse, and he was possessed by the Lucavi Hashmal. The Taurus Orosite was soon to be theirs, and with it they could bring back Duma, another Lucavi. Avelia was still their captive, able to be used to challenge for the throne if and when they needed her to, and through the Templar Knights they were recruiting hungry and powerful allies that could be possessed by the Lucavi. Vigra Folles, for example, was the latest addition to their motley crew, propositioned by a knight named Lothry as he attended to his sister's grave and offered the Ares Aurosite in exchange for his services. Everything was falling into place. The land was about to erupt into chaos, and out of that chaos, Ultima was to rise once again. There was just one problem. Despite the ruse around Ovelia going off without a hitch, Gafgarion and his soldiers were unable to secure the Taurus Aurosite. Worse still, Ramza had grown too strong, and Gafgarion's forces were completely routed. Gafgarion surmised that the next destination was to be Lionel Castle, where the real Ovelia was still being held captive. This meant one chance still remained to secure the stone, but this time there would be no retreat, no surrender. This was to be a fight to the death, because if he failed, death was all that awaited him anyway. On some level, this was bittersweet for Ramza, as after the events of Zeegden Fortress, Gafgarion had taken him in when there was nowhere else to go. Likewise, Gafgarion genuinely seemed to respect Ramza to a degree, as the pair had fought side by side multiple times under the same banner. Fate had its own plans though, and reconciliation was simply not on the cards. After a tense encounter, Gafgarion fell, finally dead by Ramza's hands. Rushing to the castle in search of Ovelia, the group were instead met by the Cardinal. He took great pleasure in informing them that Ovelia had already left, taken by Delita to Zeltenia, the home of House Goltana. Yet another manipulation was already being actioned, and Ovelia continued to be a pawn. Tired, the Cardinal offered Ramza one final choice: hand over the Taurus Aurosite and live. Ramza refused, and so the Cardinal thought to show Ramza what it was that he was denying. Pulling out the Scorpio Aurosite, the Cardinal transformed before their eyes into a dark scion, Cahulain the Impure. What followed was a very tense struggle, but they were aided by the Cardinal's failing health. Despite being a decorated veteran of the 50 Years' War, the Cardinal was in his 50s, and his body was no longer as durable as it once was. And so, unable to utilise the full power of the stone, the Cardinal, as Cahulain, was defeated, leaving behind only the Aurosite, and parting words expressing regret over dying before the return of Ultima. Picking up the stone, Ramza reflected on the battle. He did not know the full extent of the church's plottings, but he knew that they were after the Aurosite, and as he was now in possession of two of them, he himself had become embroiled in this ever-evolving conflict. Chapter 8: The War of the Lions. By this point, many of the nobles across Ivalice had become aware of Ovelia's kidnapping. Due to the slain soldiers found at the scene of the Aubon Monastery and Dysdag's cleverness, it was still believed that Druxmal Goltana was behind this heinous crime. But there was no actual proof, as the princess had not reappeared, and thus nobody had taken official ownership of the deed, and House Goltana had not made any further push for Ovelia to become queen. Delita, at the church's request, was therefore to see that the proof materialised, and at the same time, he was to sow seeds of doubt within House Goltana and weaken the Order of the Southern Sky. But Delita was also working towards his own goals that superseded those of the church, House Goltana, and House Larg, and individuals such as Dysdag Beolv. But for those goals to be realised, he also needed to use Ovelia. To convince Druxmal Goltana that his own troops had indeed kidnapped the princess, Delita began crafting the most wonderful of lies with the church. When fighting as part of the Order of the Ebony, he had come up against Baron Grimms and the Blackroom Knights numerous times, but as predicted by the church, they had fallen. Baron Grimms was slain alongside the majority of the Blackroom Knights. They planned to use this to their advantage by having Delita masquerade as one of the survivors who had a lower rank. And with the majority of the core members dead, nobody would be able to dispute it, especially as, for all intents and purposes, Delita spoke like a noble and acted like one too. This was, admittedly, quite the gamble, because if anyone did recognise or dispute Delita's claims, the game would be up. But to ensure the deception had a higher chance of success, Duality had managed to secure himself an ace in the hole, a prisoner offered by the church who was willing to lie for the cause and corroborate his story. With all the pieces in place, Duality rode to Zeltenia Castle, and after it was verified that he was indeed travelling with the princess, Duality was brought before Druxmolgotana and his senior staff to explain himself. And explain he did. The first part was to sell himself as the lieutenant in the Blackroom Knights. After that proved successful, it was next for the prisoner to do their job. They dutifully revealed that their orders had been to kidnap the princess and besmirch the good name of House Goltana, and that the architect of this plot was none other than Chancellor Glevan, one of the Duke's closest aides. Glevan was immediate with his protestations, and they were legitimate, for he did know nothing of the plot. But Duality could not allow Glevan to speak any longer, and so, invoking the laws of the land, he executed Glevan where he stood. This action, though brash, gained him the immediate attention of Druxmold, and he listened with intent as Duality explained the graveness of their current predicament. For if the plot was true, and Glevan had indeed been working with House Larg to sully the Goltana name and strengthen Orinus' claim to the throne, then that was an act of war. Wasting no time, Duality proposed that House Goltana must stand strong and retaliate. Acting as a mouthpiece for the church's secret intentions, he was convincing with his counsel. He proposed that to catch the enemy by surprise, they must immediately mobilize the Order of the Southern Sky and launch a preemptive strike. From there, they were to march on the royal city of Lassalia, depose Queen Luveria, and place Velia on the throne. Much to Duality's surprise, the Duke heeded his words, and so House Goltana and the Order of the Southern Sky, without warning, sacked the royal capital, banished Queen Luveria to Fort Besselar for conspiracy, and crowned Velia as Velia I, Queen of Ivalice, with Druxmolgotana naming himself as her regent. Bestrald Larg was incensed by this course of action. Years upon years of planning had been undone in an instant. But not to be deterred, he was quick to dispute the claims of House Goltana, declaring that Prince Orinus was the true and rightful heir, crowning him King Orinus I and naming himself as regent. Bestrald then commanded the Order of the Northern Sky to march on Fort Besselar to free his imprisoned sister. And thus did the War of the Lions begin. Thanks to Duality's advice, House Goltana started the war in a strong position. They now had complete control of Lassalia and the entire eastern portion of Ivalice, and in the captured Luveria, they had a very strong bargaining chip. It's fair to say that House Larg had been caught by complete surprise. Despite the posturing, they never expected Druxmolgotana to ever actually act. They believed he was too long in the tooth to mount any serious challenge, and that his alignment with the Order of the Southern Sky was more of a defensive measure, as opposed to an offensive one. But owing to what had transpired, Bestrald and Luveria Larg found themselves outfoxed and outmaneuvered. It left Bestrald with very few cards left to play. He must have known the assault on Fort Besselar was folly. It was too heavily fortified, and because it was on the doorstep of Linbury, the chance of any kind of prolonged siege was unlikely. But what else could he do? They had his sister, the Queen Mother of Ivalice, held captive, and if he did nothing, it would be seen as a sign of weakness. After 3 months, a stalemate presented itself. House Larg did manage to retake the capital city of Lassalia, but House Goltana still held other parts of eastern and southern Lassalia, and perhaps more importantly, they still held Fort Besselar. It meant House Larg were unable to make good on their promise to free both Luveria and place Orinus on the throne as the true king. This meant the deadlock of succession continued, but neither side were willing to back down and admit defeat. The main challenge, however, was that Ivalice was not prepared for such a conflict to erupt. While the two forces toiled away, as had been the case in the 50 Years' War, it was the common people that suffered the most. And within 3 months, poverty, disease, and unrest had begun to spread throughout the kingdom. Cid, who still held the position of commander of the Southern Sky forces, was all too familiar with this scenario, Thus did he propose a plan to his liege. It was quite simple. Use their advantage to force House Larg to sign an unfavourable peace settlement, just as Ordalia had done to Ivalice. This would secure Goltana's position as the dominant force, maintain Avelia's position as monarch, and perhaps most importantly, ensure the land could heal. Drucksmald, however, was not amused and even threatened Cid. In his mind, total war was necessary. For as long as Bestrald Larg and his nephew still breathed, conflict was inevitable. And if the common people had to suffer to ensure victory, then so be it. Anyone who was not on board with this strategy was therefore deemed no longer useful. As the campaign continued, morale amongst the troops started to suffer, and the common people continued to perish. And even the nobles, who thought themselves above the troubles of the peasantry, started to feel the consequences. The Marquis Elmdor of Limburé, for example, was struck by an arrow on the Fused Plains, dying as a result of his wounds. Word of the Marquis's death soon made the rounds at the various pubs and taverns of Ivalice, and there was concern as to how severe the conflict could become, as now even the nobles were dying. No longer was this a petty squabble between regional powers, rather, the War of the Lions was rapidly progressing into a full-blown civil war that threatened to upend the entire kingdom. But behind the scenes, other conflicts were also brewing. The War of the Lions had been manufactured by Marcel Funebris and the Church of Glabados. But even though the High Confessor believed he was the one in charge, he was unwittingly being used by the Lucavi. The death of Cardinal Delacroix, however, had altered things, and this soon became clear to the High Confessor himself, but also Ramza. With nowhere else left to turn, Ramza sought counsel from his brother Zalbarg. Unfortunately, Zalbarg refused to listen, admonishing Ramza by saying that his accusations against Dystar brought shame to the Beowulf name, and even bringing his common blood into the equation as a justification for his behaviour. Ramza was naturally crestfallen that his pleas fell on deaf ears. But having come all this way and endured so much, he still hoped to convince his brother by providing some evidence. Unfortunately, no such opportunity presented itself, as news broke that Cid and the Southern Sky Army had broken through the Northern Sky's line at Dugera Pass. Such news was shocking to Zalbarg, as his spies had last sighted Cid at Fort Besselar. And with Cid taking such an active role, Zalbarg had no choice but to stand opposite his counterpart on the battlefield. With Zalbarg now called to action, Ramza was left dejected, as the path before him was unclear. But that soon changed. The Church of Glabados was mourning the loss of Cardinal Alphonse Delacroix. Many outside of the Templars were unaware of the Lucavi plot, so from their perspective, Ramza had just murdered their cardinal and stolen a precious artifact. These accusations were then levied in person by Confessor Zalmor Luciander of the Holy Office of Inquisition, as he sought to see Ramza punished for his crimes by bringing him into custody so he might face trial. Ramza, however, realised that any submission at this point was akin to throwing his life away. A verdict as to his guilt had already been rendered. He therefore refused, and a fight broke out. It was fortunate, therefore, that Ramza was joined by his sister Alma, and thanks to their combined efforts, they forced the retreat of the Confessor. But the pair were now in a real pickle. Ramza had been branded a heretic by the church, and there was a bounty on his head. And with Alma opting to fight by his side, and the Confessor surviving, she was likely to have been branded a heretic as well. It meant they had few options left. Ramza suggested Alma seek protection from Zalbarg and forgiveness from the church, while he tried to figure out things on his own. But Alma was not willing to abandon her brother, and after deducing that the Orosite was something of great importance, she disclosed that she knew the location of one such stone and that it was not heavily guarded. That stone was the Virgo Orosite, which was still at the Auban monastery. She also deduced that because of Auban's remote location, while news of Ramza's heresy was likely to have been known, news of her heresy was unlikely to have reached there before they could reach the location themselves. The death of the cardinal had sent core members of the Church of Glabados into a spiral, not least Marcel Funebris, as the Scorpio stone was now lost to a vagabond. But the Lucavi themselves were also unimpressed by this development, and it forced them to step up their plans. The position of the Virgo stone at Aubonne had been a well-crafted move on their part, as they had seen it transported from a veritable stronghold to an almost undefended monastery. There had previously been no rush to acquire the stone, but with Ramza now in possession of both the Scorpio and the Taurus Orosite, and there being a complete lack of knowledge about his intent, waiting was no longer an option. It meant that despite their haste, upon arriving at Aubonne, Ramza and Alma found that they were too late. Soldiers from the Templar Knights, the militaristic arm of the church, were already there, and they had begun ransacking the place, searching for where the elder, Simon Penlaquiche, had hidden the stone. You see, after moving to the monastery, the elder had decided to delve into its great library, and it was here that he found the scriptures of Germanique. They painted a very different story about Saint Ajora Glabados than the church had peddled, and after studying them in great depth, Simon gained an idea of who these Templar Knights were and their objectives. So he hid the stone and refused to give them that which they sought, fearing what they might be trying to accomplish. By the time Ramza found Simon, he was on death's door, and he implored them to leave, lest they suffer the same fate as he. Ramza, however, would not budge, and his noble blood boiled. Ever since joining the Order of the Northern Sky, Ramza had tried to do what he thought was right, based on his upbringing and his principles. But each time, those noble intentions, even if they differed from the way other nobles seemed to act, only caused more problems. He struggled to comprehend the numerous lives that had been unnecessarily lost because nobles acted in certain ways, nor why certain figures were so hell-bent on seeing people who they deemed less than as expendable assets. But he also wrestled with his own conscience. Why was he continuing to be punished for wanting to do the so-called right thing? And the latest chapter of this ever-evolving book was that by trying to stop not just one nefarious plot, but multiple, he'd ended up being branded as a heretic. Seeing Simon, an old man who posed no threat to anybody, beaten to a pulp, just added fuel to the fire. But the truth was, what other path was there for him to follow anymore? He was now wanted by the church, could no longer turn to his brothers for help, and had no doubt been painted as some kind of villain in the eyes of House Goltana and the Order of the Southern Sky. It meant the only course of action that made sense was to try and stop these invaders and obtain the Virgo Orosite. This, however, led Ramza to making a logical but flawed mistake. Due to how isolated they were, Ramza thought it best to leave the Scorpio and Taurus Orosite with Alma, lest he be defeated. So before heading into the depths of the monastery, Ramza bade that Alma take the stones, leave the monastery with Simon, and seek sanctuary somewhere else. After bidding farewell, Ramza then headed into the lower vaults. But after fighting his way past some of the church's lesser soldiers, he found the Knight Templar Isilud Tengil already in possession of the Virgo Orosite. Ramza attempted to reason with the Templar, but to no avail. Thus the two began to duel, not just with swords, but also with words. It saw Isilud present Ramza with an offer: join in the church's plot like Duality had, and help them tear down both the nobility and the aristocracy. This surprised Ramza, as it reminded him of his battle with Vigraf more than his duel with Delacroix. Indeed, it seemed Isilud was unaware of the power of the Orosite, believing them to be vessels of the gods and gateways to paradise. In addition, he seemed to have been fed and was operating under the same revolutionary mindset that had drawn so many to the ill-fated Corpse Brigade more than a year prior, and indeed, the Order of the Ebon Eye. Isilud pointed out that what Ramza had been doing, namely collecting Orosite and killing those that held them, like Delacroix, was not dissimilar from what he was accusing the church of doing. Both men, steadfast in their versions of what was transpiring around them, continued their fight until Isilud, injured, faltered and took his retreat, Orosite in hand, vowing revenge. It gave Ramza much to reflect on. What was he fighting for? But there was no time to dwell in that specific moment, as with Isilud escaping with the Virgo Orosite, he needed to find Alma and take stock of the situation and everything he had learned. Unfortunately, Ramza's noble intentions proved to be his downfall. The Despite Alma's protestations of wanting to help, Ramza did not believe it was noble for his sister to have to fight. He sent her away based on the premise of saving herself, while he, as the noble squire, soldiered on. But as he emerged from the vaults, he found that Alma had been captured. The church was now in possession of the Scorpio, Taurus, and Virgo Orosite stones, and to make matters worse, the man he had tried everything to do right by, Vigraf, was standing before him. By this point, Ramza knew there was no hope in attempting to apply reason, and so the two clashed in a brutal one-on-one battle that saw both spent. But Ramza was the one who came out on top. Reeling from his defeat and barely alive, Vigraf stumbled. He lamented how much of his life had resulted in failure, and it was in this low moment, so near to death, that the Ares Orosite that he had been carrying began to react. Speaking to Vigraf, it offered him immortality, alongside the means to accomplish his goals. With nothing left to live for, Vigraf opted to make the pact like so many others had before, succumbing to the imprisoned Dark Scion to become the unwitting slave to the Lucavi, Belias. Reveling in this newfound power, Vigraf had no interest in finishing Ramza off in this moment, and he teleported from the scene to regroup with his compatriots, leaving Ramza alone with the very injured elder Simon. Simon, who could bear his wounds no longer, knew his time was up, and in his last moments he entrusted Ramza with something almost more dangerous to the church than the Orosite, the scriptures of Germanique, the only surviving record of the fact that Saint Ajora had actually conspired all those years ago to amass Orosite in a bid for power that brought down the Holy Adoran Empire, and that bit of information could prove deadly to the church's plot to win the support of the people of Ivalice if it became widely known. With the scriptures now believed to be in safe hands, Simon succumbed to his wounds, and Ramza was again left wondering what to do next. In order to avoid another treacherous situation from unfolding, he knew he had to rescue Alma, and he knew that doing so would only bring him closer to the heart of the conspiracy that was unfolding around him. Thus, he made up his mind to regroup and seek out information about Alma's captors, starting in the nearby merchant city of Dorta. In Dorta, Ramza was met by only dead ends. Nobody he spoke to seemed to have any information that was useful, and he became frustrated. But Ramza was unknowingly being sucked into yet another plot. After the conclusion of the 50 Years' War, Grand Duke Gareth Barrington had largely kept himself. Even though House Barrington served as rulers of the northern Fotherham region, and were a powerful family in their own right, they had chosen not to become embroiled in the wider politics of Ivalice, for their specialty was espionage. They had shown their penchant for this throughout the war, as while the Order of the Eastern, Northern and Southern Skies toiled away against the forces of Ordalia, they had single-handedly held off the Kingdom of Romandia before forcing them out of the war. With this job done, Barrington was happy to revert back to becoming a lesser player, as while his rivals squabbled amongst themselves, he was continuing to strengthen. You see, after the war, Barrington adopted numerous orphans. It was seen as an incredibly generous act, but there was limited altruism. For Barrington only took in these orphans on the premise that they serve him, and many were trained in the dark arts before being sent far and wide to see what they could learn about what was happening in Ivalice. As part of this, they kept their ear to the ground for talent that could be of use to the Grand Duke. When reports arrived that two youngsters who exhibited the early signs of rare skills had been identified, Barrington paid a personal visit. He verified the reports and offered the family, and indeed the village elders, a generous proposal, one that would see him adopt the children so they might serve him when they were older. The proposal was naturally refused, so Barrington did what he did best. The village was razed to the ground under mysterious circumstances, and the children were abducted. They were then forced to live with Barrington to serve, and if they stepped out of line, they were punished in quite extreme ways. The younger of the two, Rafa, remained skeptical as to the nature of their relationship with the Duke, but her brother, Marak, developed Stockholm Syndrome. Regardless, both ended up joining Barrington's infamous Kamjur assassins used to fuel his knowledge and carry out clandestine operations against his enemies. It was through this network of spies that Barrington came to know about numerous plots that were taking place, the true nature of the Orosite, and the discovery of Simon Penlaquiche as to what the scriptures of Germanique may contain. He therefore hopes to exploit these developments and increase his standing, before then making his own play for the throne of Ivalice. What happened next was therefore an inconvenience to the Lucavi plot. As Isolde was returning home with the newly retrieved Orosite crystals and Alma, he was set upon by a group of Barrington's assassins. Overwhelmed, Isolde was taken captive. Now in possession of the very things he'd heard so much about, Barrington enacted the next part of his plan, obtaining the scriptures, and since he had Alma, that was to be all too easy. Thus did Barrington send Ramza a message via Marak. He wished to make an exchange at Riavana's castle, the scriptures for his sister. With the trap set, Barrington then sent word to Folmarth Tangil, leader of the Templar Knights, and the message was similar, with Isolde's life being dangled as a carrot. En route, Ramza continued to face the grim reality of Ivalice. As he reached the border of Foverham, he stumbled upon a group of deserters from the Order of the Southern Sky. At first, they believed Ramza to be someone sent to punish them for deserting, but after realizing who he was, they instead sought to take Ramza captive, hoping for a reward from the church. Yet again, this meant Ramza had no choice but to kill men he had no direct quarrel with. But moments later, he learned that not everyone was as desperate or maniacal. Ramza had already met Oran Durai, the adopted son of Sid Orlando, through a chance encounter in the mining town of Goland. At the time, he was surprised that Ramza had offered aid given his supposed political affiliations, but he also respected his approach and his honour. It was for this reason that Oran felt comfortable in the sharing of knowledge. As it turned out, Sid was already aware of the High Confessor's role in proceedings, but he lacked the evidence to prove the church was involved in instigating the War of the Lions. But Oran also shared that if such evidence were to exist, that the Southern Sky would lay down their arms. This lifted Ramza's spirits, but before he could think about grander ideas of peace across the kingdom, he first needed to try and save his sister. As Ramza continued his journey, he stumbled upon an argument that was taking place in the walled city of Yardal. Marak, in an attempt to please Duke Barrington, had sought to ambush Ramza on his way to Riavana's, taking the scriptures without even giving him the chance to see his sister one last time. But Marak's plans were made complicated, as this was the exact moment that Rafa chose to speak up about her concerns. She had started to remember the truth about Barrington and tried her best to convey these thoughts to Marak alongside the horrible things he had done to her. But Marak did not care to listen. Even though Rafa was his sister and he was aware of the Duke's vile actions, he was too entrenched with Barrington and his judgment was clouded. All he saw standing before him now was not his sister, but someone who was attempting to ruin everything he had worked for. Thus did Marak seek to silence Rafa and Ramza in one fell swoop. It was fortunate, therefore, that the pair, when they combined their forces, were strong enough to fend off Marak's assault and survive, for alone, neither would have stood a chance. But regardless of what had happened, Barrington soon sent word that he had now changed the terms of Alma's safety, for he now demanded the scriptures and the return of Rafa. With no other options available, the pair headed for Riavana's castle, walking into what they knew was a trap for the both of them. Duke Barrington, in effect, felt like he held all the cards. Ramza was bringing him the scriptures and his troublesome adopted daughter, and Folmarth Tangil was coming to negotiate from what he believed was a position of weakness. What Barrington did not know, however, was that the Lucavi were no longer willing to sit in the shadows and play games. Thus, when Barrington attempted to coerce them with the power of his knowledge, Folmarth just channeled the power of Hashmal. He vowed to show them that some powers should not be trifled with, and undertook a massacre at Riavana's castle. None were to be left alive. Folmarth went room to room, eradicating the forces of House Barrington, while Vigraf was sent to try and obtain the scriptures from Ramza, who had now arrived at the scene with Rafa. For even though the Lucavi were powerful, what was housed within those scriptures could undermine everything they were working towards if too many people became aware of the truth hidden within. Ramza entered the castle knowing that not all was right, as after another brief encounter between Rafa and Marak, he was forced to bear witness to a guard who was mortally wounded, speaking of claws and fangs. Inside, all became clear. Vigraf stood in a hallway that was littered with the dead. He was now ready for his fated showdown. After defeating Vigraf, Ramza hoped the nightmare was over. But then something even more terrifying happened, as his rival was consumed by Belias and the true strength of the Orosite manifested. Yet, against all the odds, Ramza was able to prevail. And just as Cahulain had succumbed to Ramza before at Lionel Castle, so too now had Belias. His foe vanquished, Ramza ignored the airy stone that lay dormant on the floor, and made haste to Alma's side, fearing that, given the state of Riavana's castle, that she was in grave danger. But his decision allowed Marak to obtain the airy stone for his master, Barrington, and despite his best efforts, Ramza was unable to save his sister. Locked in a cell and unaware of the events transpiring at the castle, Alma had grown increasingly concerned at the terrifying noises and screams from the soldiers she was hearing. But Alma was not alone. Even though the Lucavi had infiltrated the Church of Glabados, and indeed the Templar Knights, only a handful of its members had been actively possessed. Individuals such as Folmar of Tengil, Alphonse de la Croix and Vigraf Folles were rare due to the finite nature of the stones. Everyone else were more akin to puppets, and this included the High Confessor himself, but also the rank and file, including Folmar's own children, Isilud and Meliadul. Neither had noticed the change in their father's behaviour following his possession by Hashmal, and they continued to follow his orders without question. As far as they were both concerned, collecting the Orosite was just part of their duty, a necessary task to ensure a bright future for the church. But after witnessing his father transform into Hashmal, Isilud realised the deception that had transpired. His first act was to try and stand up against the beast, for that was not his father. But Isilud paid for his insolence. His skull slammed against a wall. As Isilud lay there, death approaching, other guards were attempting to escape on their own. It was because of this that Alma was freed from her cell, but after making her way out of the depths, she stumbled upon Isilud. He sought atonement for his transgressions and passed her the Pisces stone, hoping it might find his way to Ramza by her hand. Unfortunately, the only thing Alma then found was the clutches of Folmarv. Although he made initial motions to kill Alma where she stood, hoping to silence the survivors, Folmarv hesitated, as his Orosite seemed to react when it was near her. Surprised, he smiled at his luck, for he had found the one thing he was searching for, something he thought may take generations to arrive. For in Alma, they had found a suitable host for Ultima's resurrection. Chapter 9. A Change in Leadership. Following the discovery of Alma as a suitable host for Ultima, the Lucavi plot needed to be expedited. Manipulating Marcel Funebris and bringing about the War of the Lions was meant to facilitate a rise in status and power for the Church of Glabados. For once House Larg and House Goltana had worn down their forces, and that of the Northern and Southern Sky Orders, the Church was to be the logical, impartial organisation to step in and provide order. With that platform established, they then hoped to secure the remaining Orosite and search for a host that could facilitate Ultima's return. The Lucavi had anticipated that this may take some time, but in Alma, such a host had already presented itself, and it meant there was no time to waste. As if to emphasise this, Folmarv was quick to exit Riavana's castle, and this meant the extermination he was undergoing remained incomplete, for they no longer cared if people knew of their existence. It meant Ramza survived, and so too did Gareth Barrington. Neither were aware that Folmarv had vacated the castle, however, and this meant Barrington still attempted to hide. But in the chaos, Rafa sought revenge against her adopted father. She felt she had him cornered, but Barrington, ever the trickster, turned the tables and berated Rafa, even mocking the cruel and horrible things he'd done to her as a way of attempting to continue the manipulation. But the Duke did not realise that Marak was listening in. After hearing the Duke's confession, Marak finally opened his eyes and saw how hurt and abused his sister had been. Now faced with two enraged and powerful fighters, the Duke looked to even the odds, and he tried to shoot Rafa preemptively. Jumping to his sister's aid, Marak took the bullet for Rafa and was killed. Barrington then sensed an opportunity. He instructed Rafa, his gun still trained on her, to search Marak's body and bring him the Orosite. She reluctantly complied, as what other choice was there? It was fortunate then that Rafa was not alone in this moment, or unfortunate depending on the perspective. In such a short space of time, so much had happened, and in the aftermath, countless guards lay slain along with Vigraf and Marak. It was a bloody massacre, but things had not yet reached their conclusion. As in Vigraf's stead, Volmar sent another Lucavi to retrieve the Ares stone and the scriptures of Germanique. As a devout member of the Church of Glabados, the Marquis Elmdor was a strong ally to their cause. His death at the Fused Plains was therefore not ideal, and the Lucavi had no choice but to use the Gemini stone to resurrect and then possess him. Elmdor was now deployed to clean up the mess at Riavana's castle, and his first act was to oversee the demise of the Grand Duke. With Barrington disposed of, Elmdor and his two minions, Celia and Letty, turned their attention towards Ramza and Rafa. It was here that Elmdor revealed Alma's fate, using it as bait to try and sway or demoralize Ramza. But he again proved himself, repelling Elmdor's assault and forcing him to retreat back to Limberry. After the battle, as Rafa mourned the loss of her brother, the Ares stone began to respond to her grief. Fearful of the same outcome that had befallen Vigraf, Ramza urged Rafa not to give in to the stone's power. But it was too late. A light began to surround her, and the stone awakened. What followed was not something Ramza would have predicted. Rather than transform Rafa into a Lucavi, like with Vigraf, the stone instead answered her innermost desires, and its great magic returned Marak to life. And this unveiled a truth about the so-called Zodiac stones. The power housed within was not inherently evil, and neither were the Lucavi who inhabited them. They had just become so warped, so focused on their objective, that collateral damage had become par for the course. And more often than not, the people who ended up wielding their power were beings who were already corrupt to the core. With Rafa and Marak now reunited, Ramza sought his own reunion. He just hoped deep down that Elmdor's words were empty. But after searching the castle in vain for any signs of her whereabouts, the only thing they found was the Pisces stone, dropped by Alma just before she was whisked away. Confused as to why such an important thing would be left behind by Folmarv, Ramza pondered his discovery and considered his next move. But while the massacre at Riavana's castle concluded, another plot was still playing out. Back in Zeltenia, Delita was continuing to grow closer and closer to Avelia, for he sought to use her just like so many others had, and this could only be achieved through manipulation. Though his words had been true to some degree, as he did intend on creating a better world, to him, Avelia was just another stepping stone along the way, and he needed her to claim the throne the same way that Druxmal Gortana did. Working behind the scenes, Delita had just played the Church and the Order of the Northern Sky, before now doing the same to Druxmal Gortana, all so he could gain the trust of Avelia. Though it was a dangerous game he played, Delita himself was gunning for the throne, and to do so, he had to keep his wits about him. Failure meant death, so he could trust absolutely no one with the truth behind his machinations. Not yet, at least. But he also had to go out of his way to prove himself loyal to those he sought to betray later. It was therefore quite fortunate that Dystark had not quite given up on his plan to assassinate Avelia, as, while she still lived, this senseless war continued, and he couldn't move on with the next part of his plan. Using their skills, two assailants were able to navigate their way to Avelia's private sanctuary, but they had not counted on Delita's presence, and after he defeated them, he he used the act to position himself as the hero who saved the Queen. This then proved to be just the platform he needed to make his own push for the crown. As in recognition for his service, Duality was promoted to the head of the Blackroom Knights, and this then enabled him to enact the next part of the church's broader plot, as they sought to assassinate both dukes and their noble commanders to send both sides into complete disarray. Elsewhere, the civil war raged on. Both the Northern and Southern Sky Orders were now heavily weakened from the constant fighting, and, just as the Church had planned, neither side was in a good position to hold on to Ivalice should they even emerge victorious. In the north, Dysdarg and Zalbarg made up a two-pronged front, working in tandem to bolster the Northern Sky's ever-increasing advantage. But the one jewel they had yet to add to their ever-growing territorial gains was Fort Besselar. Ever since the war had broken out, Luveria had been kept there as a prisoner of war, used as leverage by House Goltana against House Larg. It was therefore imperative that Fort Besselar not fall. But elsewhere, the early advantage House Goltana had gained during that preemptive strike had all but disappeared, and this meant Avelia now served as their queen from Zeltenia as opposed to the royal city of Lessalia. And, with desertion rampant, the southern sky was really only being held together by the Herculean efforts of Cid. To make matters worse, even though Cid was honour bound to serve House Goltana to his dying breath, his discontent around the war was growing, for he knew it had been started under false pretenses. Cid therefore believed there were only three ways out of this war for him. He had to die, or the fighting between the two sides had to cease for some reason. But with both leaders unable or unwilling to concede, this meant the only possible solution, as Cid had no intention of dying, was to reveal the threat the Church of Glabados and the High Confessor posed to Ivalice. But they did not have the proof they needed, despite Aran's spies searching far and wide, for the person with that proof was Ramza, an individual they did not know the whereabouts of. But it just so happened that Ramza was seeking them. By this point, he didn't know who he could trust or who might be able to answer the many questions that were swirling around in his head. Thus did Ramza choose a course of action that was both logical and illogical. He headed to Zeltenia Castle. The plan was to try and meet with Cid, a man his father who once said was more trustworthy than any other he had met, and share with him the contents of the scriptures of Germanique, hoping he might know what to do. But while he was there, Ramza also planned to try and meet with Duality, because while he knew of the various plots within the church and the power of the Orosite, he had no idea what to do with that particular information. Duality had, by this point, proven time and time again that he was no longer a trustworthy individual. The friend that Ramza once had was long gone, replaced by someone who was calculating and manipulative, someone who spoke in riddles as a way of trying to trick people into playing their hand too early. But time was running out, and Ramza was running out of people who could be considered friends or allies, because his noble actions seemed to keep making new enemies. And one of the latest was Meliador Tengil, who sought revenge for the death of her brother. Due to sheer ignorance of what had happened at Riovanna's castle, Meliador assumed the massacre had happened at the hands of Ramza, and after learning of Ramza's plans to head to Zeltenia, she plotted an ambush at the free city of Bernevia. The ambush went off without a hitch, and Ramza found himself in an all too common situation. He was forced to square off against someone accusing him of a crime he had not committed. Despite his attempts to again explain the truth, his words fell on deaf ears due to the perceived preposterous nature of his claims. Fortunately, Meliador was no more successful than any of the others who had tried to claim his life, and she retreated to lick her wounds. But the encounter made Ramza's position even more clear, because Meliador was right. When Ramza said his claims aloud, they did sound preposterous. This was why meeting with Duality was of paramount importance, because he was at least someone who understood what was going on, and Ramza just hoped he would see sense and help him try to end this madness. Unfortunately, Duality had plans to the contrary. After thwarting the assassination attempt against Avelia and receiving his promotion, Duality felt as though everything was going according to plan. He now had the prestige and social credit to further relations, and he had managed to grow closer to Avelia, even sharing intimate details of his sister's death and promising the same fate would never befall her while he still lived. Drux-Mar-Goltana also grew more trusting of the new head of the Blackroom Knights, granting him unprecedented access to the inner circle. Thus, when Ramza showed up at Zeltennia Castle, Delita was feeling quite arrogant. And once they were alone, he had no qualms with revealing everything he knew, that the Church and the High Confessor had been behind the war, that they planned to push the already tired and hurting populace to the brink, and that when that happened and everything was at its limit, they were to swoop in, act as saviour, and solidify their ascension to power at the expense of both houses. And to top it all off, to ensure the continued struggle went the way they wanted, Delita was to soon assassinate both Drux-Mar-Goltana and Sidolphus Orlando. And at the same time, his co-conspirators within the Church were to take care of Zalbarg, Dystarg, and Bestroled Larg, thus completely dismantling either side's ability to fight back against the Church's power play. The icing on the cake was that this plan was to be enacted at Fort Besselar, where Louveria was being held, and that everything, even the imprisonment of Louveria at this location, had been planned down to the last detail by agents from the Church who had been manipulating everything. Even now, the Church had deployed a member of their order, called Barak Fenzor, to effect the upcoming battle at Belisar, while others spread false intelligence that Cid was to betray House Goltana. After this exposition dump, Delita then just demanded casually that Ramza hand over the auracite he had collected, hoping to exploit the friendship they once had and gain access to their incredible power. But this time, Ramza refused to comply. Before they could hash out their differences, however, they were interrupted by Confessor Zalmor, who had been tracking Ramza's movements. After suffering a chastening defeat before, the Confessor was not willing to accept defeat again. He was here to make Ramza pay for his heresy. But as Delita was seen consorting with Ramza, that charge was now expanded to include the pair of them. For even though the Confessor may have been aware that Delita was working on behalf of the Church, the fact he was consorting with Ramza suggested he could not be trusted. This was less than ideal for Delita, so, ever the pragmatist, he worked with Ramza to kill the Confessor, to ensure that knowledge of their relationship did not become commonly known. And after the evidence was exposed of, Delita then received some bad news. To ensure he carried out the planned assassinations, he had been appointed an assistant named Valmafra, and she was to kill him should there be any sign of deviation from the plan. She then appeared to inform Delita that he had missed his planned window to carry out the assassination of Cid, and that he really shouldn't miss the next one. But as this information was divulged with Ramza present, it meant Cid's location was revealed. Rushing to Fort Besselar with the hope of reaching Cid before Delita, Ramza encountered Barak and soon discovered the depths of their plot. To ensure a resolution that suited the Church, Barak had poisoned the entire Northern Sky forces of Dystarg Beowulf and Bestrald Larg by unleashing moss fungus spores into the air. This was not meant to kill the troops, as that would be too obvious. Instead, it was designed to lower their combat function and give the Order of the Southern Sky the edge, thus encouraging them to go on the offensive and leave Fort Besselar undefended. It was an ingenious plan, and everything played out as the Church expected. Well, almost. With the Northern Sky forces hindered, the Southern Sky forces did take a more offensive stance. Cid was taken into custody for plotting against Drux-Mar-Goltana owing to the spurious rumours that were circulating, and Delita, who had arrived before Ramza, was then promoted to head of the Order of the Southern Sky in response. While this was transpiring at the fort itself, Zalbarg arrived late on the scene with reinforcements to find a sea of corpses, with even Dystarg and the Duke suffering from some strange symptoms. But then, Zalbarg watched as his brother's grand plan started to play out before his very eyes. With the Duke struggling from the poisoning, Dystarg produced a dagger from his cloak and stabbed Bestroled Larg in the chest, before then commanding Zalbarg to make it look as though he had been killed by assassins sent by the Southern Sky Order. Zalbarg was taken aback by his brother's actions. To him, these were not honourable, they were not Beowulf. But Dystarg cared little for his brother's pathetic morals, for with the Duke dead, he believed he was now free to take up the mantle of regent to the self-proclaimed King Orinus. It meant one of the Church's major targets was now dead, while another was imprisoned, and it looked like the rest would soon fall. But both Delita and Ramza were now to alter that plan in quite a significant way. With the battle swinging in favour of House Goltana, Duality laid low in Fort Basilar, waiting for the right moment to strike against his new master. But while he waited, he commanded Valmafra to assist Ramza, who he knew was attempting to mount a rescue for Cid. As despite what the church wanted, Duality realised Cid was more useful to him alive than dead. Thus, after Ramza opened the castle's sluice gates before breaking through the outer defences, he was able to regroup with Oran and, with the assistance of Valmafra, make his way to Cid's cell. Cid was more than happy to escape, having now become disillusioned. For decades, he had pledged his sword to the nobility, and fought alongside Druxmal Goltana as comrades in arms during the 50 Years' War. But now, without even a shred of evidence, he was to be executed for treason. Unsure what to do, Cid vowed to support Ramza's cause, for while he had known of the church's dark plot, his previous role meant he lacked the mobility to conduct either a thorough investigation or even act. Now though, he had none of those concerns, and those who sought to bring about his demise were to be punished by his judgment. After Valmafra then informed Duality of Cid's escape, he was free to enact the mission that had been entrusted by the church. Angered that the sluice gates had been opened without his permission, Druxmal summoned Duality and commanded them to launch a full-on assault to crush their enemies. But Duality refused, and then killed the would-be king. To ensure the church's wider wishes still manifested, a devout follower of Glabados, who was a Cid Orlando doppelganger, was executed next to the Duke to ensure it looked as though they had both killed each other. After news reached the church that 3 of their 4 targets were now dead, Marcel Funebris then tried his best to offer the church as the solution to the nation's problems. But what he had not factored into the equation was what would happen if neither side accepted peace following the death of their existing leadership. What would happen if those leaders were replaced by new, younger and more ambitious figureheads? For that is exactly what happened, as following the death of Druxmal Goltana and the supposed death of Cid Orlando, Duality had already been promoted to the head of the Southern Sky, and he now stepped in to act as regent to Avelia. And following the death of Bestrald Larg and the continued imprisonment of Luveria, Dystark stepped in as regent to Orinas. Thus, the High Confessor's demands fell on deaf ears, and he began to realise the power he thought he held counted for very little. Chapter 10. The Resurrection. While Ivalice became acclimatised to this new normal, the Lucavi continued to pull the strings from behind the scenes. They cared little about Funebris's failed plots or the demise of House Barrington, House Larg and House Goltana. For in Alma, they now had their vessel. Contingency plans were important, however, for even though they had the Virgo Aurosite and powerful figures were under the thrall of the other Aurosite, Alphonse Delacroix had been vanquished, as had Vigraf, and Ramza still held numerous Aurosite stones himself. They also, due to the expediting of their plans to revive Ultima, needed to find the necrol of Melond and obtain the scriptures of Germanique. This saw them do what Marcel Funebris could not, as Lothry was dispatched to manipulate Dystark. He offered him the Capricorn Aurosite as if it was a gift from the church as congratulations for his new position, while making it very clear that they were well aware he had assassinated his own father. They then, after inferring that Alma was being held at Limbury, expected Ramza to soon arrive and deliver the scriptures. The Marquis was then delighted when Ramza dutifully arrived on cue, for he had been waiting for a chance to seek revenge. He first attacked Ramza in his regular human form, hoping that the previous encounter was a mere fluke. But after Ramza came through the test, Elmdor was forced to retreat to the castle's undercroft, and it was here that the true might of the Gemini Aurosite was witnessed as Elmdor transformed into Zalera. During this hellscape, Ramza faced his toughest test, but he gained an unexpected ally. Meliadul had been watching Ramza from afar, and when she saw him heading to Limbury, she had hoped to join forces with the Marquis. But after witnessing Zalera with her own eyes, she came to realise that Ramza had spoken the truth, and after being goaded by words of her father's possession, Meliadul opted to turn her back on the church and aid Ramza instead. Coming through the battle unscathed, they obtained the Gemini Aurosite and dealt another blow to the Lucavi plot. But having learned that Dystog had been gifted the Capricorn aura sight, Ramza made haste back to Irgro's castle, fearing that the fate that befell Vigraf may soon befall his brother. But while Ramza was concerned, the other brother, Zalbarg, was less so. Having overheard the conversation that took place between Dystog and Lothri, he had rushed to his father's grave to see if evidence of moss fungus poisoning was present. To his dismay, there it was, clear as day. Filled with rage at his brother's actions, Zalbarg now had proof of what he had previously refused to accept, and he too ventured to Irgro's castle, but not to save his brother, to confront him. With both Ramza and Zalbarg now on a collision course, the future of the Northern Sky, and indeed House Beowulf, seemed in serious peril. But things were not going so well in the opposing forces either. Having conspired with so many different factions, Delita was now starting to find it hard to keep track of his many deceptions, and this was only further complicated following his decision to imprison Oran after he had stayed behind to try and clear Sid's name. Oran, however, had managed to escape and proceeded to reveal what he knew to Avelia, but when Delita came upon the scene, instead of denying it, he revealed his plan. The Northern Sky were to fall, the Church were to be crushed, and the Southern Sky were to be used to build a new order. This seemed like complete madness, and Valmafra, who had previously accepted Delita changing the plans, even sought to turn on Delita for his betrayal. But for some reason, she stayed her blade. By this point, Delita had grown so confident that he now believed he was untouchable, but he underestimated how much damage the truth could eventually do once it found its way out. And this was something Dystog was also going to learn the hard way. Zalbarg had confronted him at Irgro's castle and bested him in combat, but he also showed naivety. He was making these accusations at Dystog's home, and it was easy for him to therefore convince the castle guards that Zalbarg had gone mad and that he needed to be arrested. Finding himself surrounded, hope seemed lost for Zalbarg. It was fortunate then that Ramza arrived at the opportune moment to even the odds, and soon Dystog was defeated. But as death's door started to approach, the Capricorn aura sight activated, and Dystog willingly made a deal, transforming into Adramelech the Wrath. Wasting no time, Adramelech focused all its powers on Zalbarg and annihilated him in an instant, the Lucavi's full power on display. After witnessing this, Ramza was horrified, but it gave him the resolve he needed, for there was no way he would allow Adramelech to continue his rampage unhindered. Thus was Adramelech, one of the strongest Lucavi, defeated by a mere mortal. After the Capricorn aura sight reverted back to its original form, Ramza was then left to lament the death of his brothers and the fall of House Beowulf. All three of the brothers had acted in ways they thought would best serve Ivalice and represent their name, but their desires had led them into direct conflict with each other. In the end, it was their deeds and not their name that made them who they were, and Ramza had emerged as the hollow victor. But his job was not yet done. There was still the chance he could save his sister and put an end to Folmarv's plans. After learning that both Zelera and Adramelech had been defeated, Folmarv was dismayed. This human was proving to be a significant pest, and it forced a change of tactics. Rounding up the support of the remaining Templar knights in the Church of Glabados, Folmarv convinced them they had been deceived by the Church, and he turned them against Marcel Funebris. When this all began, the Church had three objectives: incite war, take over as the ruling power, and collect the aura sight. Two of the three had failed. Because while the war had happened and both sides had suffered, the people had rejected the Church as a mediator, and by this point, Ramza had collected more aura sight. Thus the Templars turned on Funebris. In an effort to save his skin, the High Confessor revealed the location of the Necrol of Melond, but he also revealed another wrinkle. The scriptures of Germanique needed to be obtained if Folmarv wished to gain entrance. This frustrated Folmarv to no end, and as the High Confessor had outlived his usefulness, he took out his frustration on the old man. For the scriptures had been within his grasp at Riovanna's castle and numerous other points since, and he could have easily killed Ramza and obtained the scriptures had he known of their value. It was rather fortunate, therefore, that Ramza arrived at the scene not too long after, as he was still hunting for his sister. Given the defeat of so many Lucavi at the hands of Ramza, Folmarv was not going to let his ego stand in the way of Ultun's return. Realizing that Ramza was likely to be in a bargaining mood given Alma's circumstance, the Templars therefore offered her life in exchange for the scriptures and the Orosite. But Ramza had started to learn that people in Ivalice were often deceptive, and he opted to play ball, but only partially. In his mind, the scriptures had no real value anymore. Ramza had planned to use them to expose the church, but with Ivalice now in complete chaos, there was nobody left worth exposing. Thus, he was more than happy to hand over the scriptures, but he refused to hand over the Orosite, knowing what power they held. Folmarv accepted the adjusted deal, and after the exchange was made and the scriptures were verified as genuine, he then attacked Ramza to seize the Orosite by force. It was fortunate then that Ramza and his companions were able to stand up to Folmarv, but as they chased him to the inner sanctuary of the cathedral, Folmarv used dark magic to revive Zalbarg and commanded him to kill his brother. This was incredibly traumatic, and after winning, Ramza was forced again to suffer the grief of losing him. But Zalbarg had merely been a distraction. Folmarv and the other Templars had escaped with the scriptures, Alma, and the knowledge of the location of the Necrol of Malond, and they now had, so they thought, everything they needed to bring about Ultima's resurrection. But Ramza was clueless to all of these elements. From his perspective, everything seemed lost. That was until they received useful information from an unlikely source. The High Confessor, who was still clinging to life, revealed that Folmarv was bound for Aubon. With haste, he vowed to save Alma and defeat the Lucavi plot so that Ivalice might be spared. When he arrived at Aubon, Ramza encountered numerous obstacles. The first Templar knight to stand in his way was Lothri, the agent responsible for gifting so many Orosite to numerous powerful individuals. Ramza dispatched the knight quickly, who then, as a parting gift, opened the way to the Necrol. Now at the point of no return, Ramza dove deeper into the darkness that surrounded him, eager to see his mission through to the end and rescue Alma. The Necrol was a dank and dark place, containing the ruins of the ancient city of Malond that was destroyed all those years ago in the events that followed the death of Saint Ajora. It was here that the Templar Knights made their final stand. The first to fall in the Necrol was Cletien, with Barak falling soon after. With all obstacles now removed between him and the mastermind behind everything, Ramza proceeded to the airship graveyard deep in the Necrol. But here he came upon a horrible sight, for Folmarv was deep in the ritual of attempting to revive Ultima. Something, though, was amiss. Folmarv's efforts were failing, and the ritual was proving unsuccessful. He believed that the reason behind this was that not enough blood had yet been spilled. So Folmarv transformed into Hashmal, seeking to offer Ramza and his companions up as a blood sacrifice. But even the might of Hashmal could not stand against Ramza. It seemed that the Lucavi plot had been brought to an end, but Folmarv had one trick up its sleeve. Ripping into his own chest and spilling his own blood, he sacrificed himself at the altar of Ultima, and thus Saint Ajora was born anew, into the body of Alma Beolve. Something again, though, was not right. Though Saint Ajora was born again, Alma's consciousness seemed to persist. It fought with that of Ajora, but was no match, and her body was flung aside and separated. Ramza rushed to his sister's aid, finding her unharmed. She begged Ramza to dispatch Saint Ajora quickly, but her pleas were cut short as Ajora transformed into her true form, that of Ultima, the High Seraph. Next to Ultima, the other Lucavi, even Hashmal, were mere pawns. And though none of the Lucavi were around to witness the return of Ultima, they had succeeded, and she had no intention of letting their sacrifices be in vain. For this battle, however, Ramza had the aid of his sister, and together, the two, with the assistance of their close companions, were able to hold back Ultima's onslaught. After then transforming into her most powerful form, Ultima renewed her attack, and all seemed lost. But Ultima made a grievous error, an error that had been made time and time again. She underestimated the sheer grit, determination, and doggedness of humanity. Thus, it was with disbelief that Ultima began to feel herself losing control of the situation. After laying in prison for so long and waiting for her chance to finally be free, Ultima was left dumbfounded that she was unable to put a stop to Ramza and his ragtag bunch of humans. What's more, she then realized something. Ramza and Alma came from the very same bloodline that had vanquished her previously, lending validity to her growing fears around how the situation was progressing. And so, as a last resort, Ultima decided that if she was not going to win, that everyone else would perish with her, for while the Orocytes still existed, she would merely need to wait for the next cycle to begin anew. Using the last of her power, Ultima then created a huge explosion that engulfed the entirety of the airship graveyard and the Necrol of Malond, and none were recorded to have survived. Following the events of the Necrol, Ivalice attempted to return to normalcy. There was a funeral to mourn all those lost from House Beolve, but Ramza was purposefully excluded. Despite his noble actions, in the eyes of the Church, Ramza was still very much a heretic, and as such, he was given a heretic's burial. Oran Durai was one of the few to have known the truth of his deeds, and how he had saved Ivalice from near complete annihilation. And as he stood there in the cemetery, he even thought he saw Ramza and Alma in the distance, riding away from the funeral on a chocobo. Choosing to believe that Ramza still drew breath, Oran set about making an account of what had happened regarding Ramza, the War of the Lions, and the Church of Glabados. He then presented his work to the Clemensian Council, who had been convened for the purpose of selecting a new High Confessor, but this turned out to be a grave mistake. Oran had noble intentions, but even though a lot of the corruption had been rooted out from the top of the church, it was still buried deep, and they had no intention of letting the truth behind what had happened escape for fear that it might lessen their grip on the peoples of Ivalice. The Clemensian Council therefore chose to abuse its power, labelling Oran a heretic and burning him at the stake for his perceived crimes. Oran's account of the War of the Lions, known as the Durai Papers, were then buried deep in the archives until they were forgotten by time. To the east, as the Order of the Northern Sky were now rudderless, they were no match for Delita and his Order of the Southern Sky, and the combined forces of the Gallione and Lassalia regions surrendered with a whimper. This then put a swift end to Prince Orinus' claim to the throne, and Develia was appointed as the true Queen of Ivalice. But Delita then exploited a loophole. Avelia was still deemed too young to rule, requiring a regent, but Delita, who was only a year older, was of age. After breaking down Avelia's will, he convinced her that marriage was the best way to secure their future, and so, instead of becoming a prince consort, which was the normal course of action should a queen already be the reigning monarch, Delita was crowned King of Ivalice through marriage, and Avelia was demoted to the lesser position of Queen. Starting from the lowest order in society, this meant Delita had beaten the odds to create his own personal vision for a better Ivalice, one where he was the ruler, and the beauty of it was, everyone who knew the truth about his actions was dead, including all those powerful nobles and members of the clergy, and even the likes of Oran and Ramza, everyone that was, except Avelia. She had been a pawn for much of her life, and for a time, Delita had felt like the first person who had actually cared for her. That was, until his confession to Oran and his brazenness when describing what Avelia meant to him. Even though she went through with the ceremony, Avelia knew that Delita was not someone she wanted to spend the rest of her life with, for he had used her just like everyone else. And so it was, on Avelia's own birthday, that she made her own move, the first move she had really been able to make for herself. Approached by Delita in what he assumed was a tender moment, Avelia quickly pulled a hidden blade and stabbed Delita in the stomach. He was surprised, but he understood Avelia's rage, but this was no time for forgiveness. So, Delita delivered a fatal blow to Avelia, killing his wife and queen, and ensuring that she too would not live to tell the tale of how he came to power. This betrayal by Avelia was a tough pill for Delita to swallow, for even though he had used her, he also did want to save her, and the way she felt in response was incredibly disheartening. It meant that, having managed to survive the wound himself, Delita was forced to rule despite knowing that everyone whom he'd once held dear had perished. Ramza, for his part though, was still very much alive. He had just not made his dwelling in Ivalice. Instead, Ramza had crossed the border into Ordalia, hoping to start anew with his friends. Following the conclusion of the 50 Years' War, the focus of Ivalice turned inwards as they dealt with their own issues of succession and the horrible peace deal that had been signed with Ordalia. The assumption, therefore, was that Ordalia had been prospering while Ivalice had struggled. But the citizens of Ordalia were not happy with the rule of King Leonard. His ruthlessness when dealing with Ivalice transferred to his own people, as he sought to oppress any who spoke out against him. Unable to sit idly by while the people of Ordalia struggled around him, Ramza thus got pulled into another fight that was not his own. The situation was then further complicated by the actions of Duality. Seeking to secure his position as a new legitimate ruler and build some alliances, he sought to send aid to Leonard so that the resistance might be quashed. How that conflict played out, though, remains unclear. According to records, the Kingdom of Ivalice prospered, at least for a time, under the rule of Duality, but the threat of the Lucavi was always there, as was the return of Ultima. That, though, concludes the complete, unabridged timeline of Final Fantasy Tactics. My name is Daryl, and I'd like to thank you all so much for watching. Putting this series together was, as you can imagine, a pretty huge undertaking, and I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon, because their funding really does help to ensure we can make these kinds of massive videos. But now, to an important question. We'd like you to tell us in the comments which game to cover next. Oh, and if you did enjoy this series, please make sure to hit that like button. And make sure you subscribe too and hit the notification bell so you're informed when we post up our next timeline series. A big thank you needs to be extended to Mark Choi, the Ivor Novello nominated composer of Empire of the Ants, who was commissioned to provide some sublime arrangements for this video. For those who are interested in further listening, we should be releasing the full playlist to Spotify and other streaming platforms in the coming months. We'd also like to thank the likes of Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, Christopher Gardner, Clever Chavez, EXPiriquad on YouTube, Gregory and Stephen, who are super special Onion Knight supporters on Patreon, and everyone else who supports us via crowdfunding platforms. Alright everyone, this is Daryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.